So it's recognizing the projector as a second screen. So
Okay.
I don't do work normally on two computers. Same concept. So if you scroll to the right, it will function as that screen, if that makes sense. So to come back to this one, you would just scroll to the left.
Right
And you
now, I
come
don't
back.
have to do anything.
No, so everything is on there.
Okay, it's recorded.
Yeah, so now you're recording.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, sorry for the confusion, but we're ready to get started. So, Steve. it's all yours.
Okay, right, go ahead and begin. Well, good morning, everyone. My first turf type talk I've given in 3 years, so forgive me if I'm doing a little hemming and hawing here. I was reviewing it just the other night, last couple of nights. I said, boy, it's a good thing I looked this over. And so, this talk is not really geared for commercial turf managers. It's more for master gardeners, or it's not technically master gardeners. It's Gloucester County super gardeners. What's it? Okay, but is it, how many of the Gloucester County gardeners are here? Not commercial? Just, I see 5 hands.
You
So
you also have Camden County certified gardeners watching via Zoom.
oh yeah, oh, this is being recorded, so I have to watch what I say. It takes all the fun away. Man, I'm gonna have no fun today at all. But so anyway, yeah, I drove up. I should introduce myself. I'm Steve Redke. I'm with Rutgers Cooperative Extension for the last 27 years, and I work predominantly, however, with greenhouse nursery commercial growers, and I do a consulting and advising type of service for them. But I've interacted with turf guys and landscapers over the years as well, so I can do at least a halfway decent job with this kind of a talk. But it's, as I said, it's really geared for the more of the home gardener and not the commercial. And I'm really not going to talk too much about the insect diseases and the weeds. I'm not. It's going to be just some of the basic fundamental, practices that, oftentimes home gardeners don't understand, or they misunderstand and misinterpret. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on. So for a lot of you commercial guys who've been around for decades or more, this is going to be a review. So sorry about that. At least you get your credits, right? So, all right. So as we go through this, and it doesn't work. Mary, we lost our advancer now. They made some changes, and then we're not advancing. And so, yeah, this is the first session they've given in person since the whole pandemic began, and so I guess these restartup pains are part of it. So, yeah, it was working, and now it's not. So, yeah, this talk is really geared toward the slides. It's hard for me to even think about what to talk about without the slides. Anyway. As I said, that I can maybe just talk about the first few slides I was going to show, but the insect pests, which oftentimes in the past, Mary had 2 separate talks for turf. One was gearing on the pests, the insects, the diseases, and the weeds. Then the other one was the more cultural type, proper, best management type practices for home lawns to prevent those insects and diseases and weeds from even occurring in the first place, or at least reducing them. So as far as, I don't even have any pictures on these, and the insects, there's really not that many, at least in home turf. There's really called the big 4. Number 1 by far are the white grubs, and second would be chinch bugs. Now, as home gardeners, I bet that you're familiar with white grubs, Japanese beetles, but there's also now oriental beetles, which are even more common than Japanese beetles, at least in New Jersey. And and then the other one, maybe the second most important would be chinch bugs. You probably have heard about them, but they're really quite tiny. You have to get down on your hands and knees to see them. You have to maybe knead the thatch, because they love thatch. If you have high thatch levels, then it's not working. Apparently not. Go back, get Nick. Yeah. I'm not all that tech savvy. I don't want to even bother touching it. I'll mess it up. So, but and then chinch bugs is one that you have to really get down close and look for it. You'll find them often in high thatch. Okay. And then the other two are much kind of a distant third and fourth would be sawed webworm, which are caterpillars, and kind of makes your grass just disappear as the caterpillars feed. Predominantly at night, they're going to be most active, and they actually consume the entire foliage of the blades of the turf. And then you also have bluegrass billbug, which is one that feeds in the blade initially, and then it gets too big for the blade. As they grow in size, they start feeding in the stem, and they'll get down into the crown of the turf. And that's one of those easy diagnosis. If you suspect you've got billbug, you just pull it up and it just breaks apart really easy because they feed it's hollow. The grass is mostly dead now anyway, so it's not a difficult diagnosis once you know what to look for. As far as the diseases, in the home lawns, we got maybe the top six that we see time and time again, and maybe really even five. There's one in the Pythium we don't see nearly as much in home lawns as we do in, say, golf courses. But maybe this is one for a quick question for the commercial. I probably should know this. What are the 1 and 2 most common diseases in home lawns as far as the fungi? Let me get to it here. Thank you. Which are probably the top? No, there's no doubt about this. This is kind of an easy question. What are the 2 most common diseases we find in our home lawns? You know, there's a lot of turf managers who never apply fungicides. And so when they have to deal with the disease, they just kind of, if it's one of these 2 diseases, they can put fertilizer down and just pretty much maybe mask it over. And that would be dollar spot and red thread. They're kind of low nutrients. They become more prevalent in stressed conditions, especially when you have lower nitrogen levels. And so those are the 2 diseases we find invariably. Almost every lawn, at least in one section here or there, are going to have either the red thread or the dollar spot. And one usually often comes in off the other. Red thread comes in first in the season, in the spring. It tolerates the cooler temperatures, and then when it gets warmer, then the dollar spot comes in. Okay. And then here we have some weeds. This would take, I think we have an entire talk. In fact, I know there are entire talks, 2.5-hour talks just on weeds, which is something I would not envy anyone doing. But there's a lot of weeds out there, and in practice, no question, as far as commercial landscape lawn managers, their #1 pesticide is invariably going to be herbicides. Yeah, they put down a lot of herbicides. In fact, I think it's pretty high. The last I've heard is maybe 85% of the pesticides that professional turf managers put down, 85% are herbicides. And so the fungicides would be the third, and the second would be the insecticides, predominantly against white grubs. Okay. But one thing, if you begin to hear, this is relatively recent, just about 3 weeks ago, Governor Murphy from New Jersey has put some restrictions in the future on the use of the neonicotinoids for residential landscapes. Some of you been hearing about this? Yeah. It's going to be pretty much, at least with residential landscapes, the neonicotinoids are going to be mostly eliminated. Okay, and next year, commercial can continue to use them. If you have a commercial license, you can continue to use the neonicotinoids. Some of the more common ones would be imidacloprid and dinotefuran. And there's maybe like 4 or 5 common ones, the neonicotinoids that are used. But my understanding is that there may be some exceptions, though, which is not clear how this is going to work. Usually it's involving invasive type insects. Because if you're not familiar with neonicotinoids, they are an insecticide. And they're the most common insecticide used in the country. And they've been targeted because of the potential negative impact they have with our pollinators. And it's these materials are very useful, so it's unfortunate that apparently, at least in residential areas, they're going to even eliminate it for commercial applicators. So how many of the commercial guys have heard that? Four of you. Yeah, not really good news, is it? Yeah, actually, I was a little disappointed. I use the material myself, but I use it against the emerald ash borer as a treatment, vinyl Teflon, which is Trans-Tech, is a bark spray. But anyway, so with that good note, let's move on. But I actually started with herbicides. These are just some of the common weeds, and we divide them up into categories. We have our broadleaf weeds, the annual, as well as the perennial types. And then with the annual weeds, broadleaf, we have summer and then winter. And so ones that we're probably most familiar with as far as annual broadleaf would be, I would think many of you know spotted spurge, kind of when you have really a compacted soil, like we found them maybe between areas next to your sidewalk or your driveway. They really like the compacted soil. That got hot and dry, and so that would be number one, probably with this annual broadleaf weeds in the summer. And then some of the winter annuals broadleaf, people don't really are too concerned about them if you're a homeowner, because you're not really outside that much in the winter, perhaps. But some of these, a few of them are really rather attractive. I think henbit and dead nettle, they got some beautiful flowers they put out in the in the late winter, early spring. It's kind of a purple flower, but most people don't worry about it too much. And then broadleaf perennial dandelion would be number one, undoubtedly. And then we have things like white clover. Many of you are familiar with white clover, of course. And so that's the concern with turf managers and the neonicotinoids and the effect on pollinators, because you have a lot of pollinators come in and they feed on the white clover and the nectar and the pollen. So that can negatively affect them. So, all right, and so these are just some of the annual grasses and perennial as well. Same thing, summer as well as winter. Crabgrass, number one. In fact, there's no question that the number one herbicide is used against crabgrass as a pre-emergent. Okay, oftentimes twice a year. And then we have annual bluegrass. Annual bluegrass is kind of interesting. It's a winter grassy annual. And you'll see that early spring, mid-spring, and it can have the ability to produce fluorescence or flowering at a very, even if we cut it pretty short, it's able to produce it, and you can see it. The thing is, if you have a lot of annual bluegrass during the time the summer arrives, suddenly your grass is disappearing because it's dying out, because it can't, it's an annual weed and it can't tolerate the heat of summer very well. So sometimes if you have too much annual bluegrass, it may look good in the winter, but not in the summer with turf. All right, so I'm not going to spend any more time on this. There's also different types that are not grassy or broadleaf, things like yellow nutsedge, very commonly well known. In fact, if you go from yellow nutsedge, moss, liverwort, and algae, as it continually gets wetter and wetter in the soil, then these other types of growth begin to take place. So the wettest is when you start getting algae beginning to grow. And if you ever see a very wet and maybe it's even some standing water for a period of time, start having algae growing, and then it dries out, say in the middle of the summer, and there's no more rain for a while, then you get a black crust forming on the soil, and that would be that's the dead algae. And so I see a lot of liverwort, and I do work in nurseries and container bays, and in the containers you get this liverwort growing, and that also likes it quite wet, because they're constantly, with being in a container with soilless media, constantly wetting the containers, and the liverwort can survive pretty well in those wet conditions. So anyway, I'm not going to go into detail about any of that stuff. I'm pretty much already covered them. You can be willing to ask questions as I go along, as I speak about this more cultural practices and maybe establishments of a good turf. So if you do have other questions about weeds and diseases and so forth, insects, so you can ask as we go along. So this is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about some of the ID characteristics. We want to identify the species of turfgrass. They have the same thing with identifying weeds. Use different characteristics, the anatomy or the morphology really of the different parts of the plant that you can look at, and it can give you what the idea of it is. There's some more simplistic ways to identify species of grass. I'll talk about that. And then we're going to just do about the common fundamental stuff like mowing and fertilizing and irrigation and liming. And so this is how the talk's going to proceed. It's pretty basic. This is all good stuff that everyone should know to enable them to utilize the best horticultural practices to prevent those pests from occurring in the first place, or at least to reduce them. So that's the whole idea about learning how to manage the turf properly. All right, so let's get started. You got two very different types of residential landscapes there. Which do you prefer? If you're a turf manager, I know what type you want. If you're gonna make any money, you want the one on the left. That's kind of a turf dominant landscape. But I would assume, and there's not many of the home gardeners here, but I think if I would make my guess, would probably more of you would lean toward the right. Yeah. A lot of flowers, a lot of pollinators coming in, maybe beneficial insects. You got a lot of diversity of plants. Not much turf there at all. So you're not going to make money as a turf manager. So anyways, different people have different tastes. Americans, for the most part, they love their lawns. So it's good for the lawn care industry. You go over, I haven't ever been to Europe, but apparently places like England, they don't really love their lawns very much. They much prefer the stuff there on the right. And in some cases, this is a photograph I took decades ago, and probably like 65% of their turf was English ivy. It was a small front yard, and I mean, there's not going to be much more. They had a small section there toward the left, but so that was another way. The thing is, this is a monoculture, and so you got kind of a disease moving into the English ivy. It may take out everything. So you have to be aware of when you plant just a single plant with monoculture as shown there. And also English ivy prefers to be in more of a shaded condition. This was mostly in full sun. It was beginning to show some scorching as well. Can't really see it too well on this photograph. It looks okay here, but it was scorched pretty badly in some areas. All right, so let's take a look at the anatomy of turfgrass and how it's identified. This is the case where you have to kind of get down close. Sometimes the use of a hand lens is very useful, and look at the anatomy and different parts. And what we're really focusing in is right there, that red circle. If you wanted to do, if you had access to the inflorescence or the flowering of the grasses, that's what you would, if you were really an expert in plant ID with grasses, that's probably what you would want. But since we're cutting our grasses, normally, also it's annual bluegrass, we're not going to have the inflorescence. And so we have to go with more of a secondary area, and that is right where the blade attaches to the sheath, right there in that red. And this is where you get things like auricles and collars and ligules and vernation and all this. This is where a book would have to be opened up. And, you know, most of us don't want to spend the effort and the time going through what's called keys. They're dichotomous keys. Usually you have two choices, sometimes three, or maybe occasionally four choices based on what you're observing. You make that selection and you just keep narrowing it down until you get to the identification of whatever you're looking at. So that's just kind of what I mean by this. And as I don't know how many commercial guys have done ID by using things like oracles and the collar and the ligule. Anyone do it? Yeah, I see one hand. Not surprising. I mean, I've done it only because I'm kind of been forced to over the years. But for the most part, you get to learn. If you're a professional turf manager, you can pretty much, at least species, tell the identification with other characteristics without having to go to the books and with the hand lenses by looking at these features. But this is what they are. It's the way, in this case, how the blade is attached to the stem, or what the shape of the collar is. Sometimes the collar is broad, sometimes it's narrow. And there's just different things you have to choose from and characteristics. Membranous ligule or hairy ligule. And then really a key area is this right where that kind of the bud is between the leaf and the stem. You would cut into it to determine if the bud is rolled or is it folded. And that's called vernation, and that's another way to distinguish between different species of grasses. So this is something that's available to be done if you really want to get scientific. But like myself, I usually just look at photographs. That's my scientific method half the time. Okay. All right. So as far as our major lawns we have in this part of the country, we have cool season. We do have some warm season, and a couple of them there, zoysia grass and Bermuda grass with our warm season. We're beginning, well, we've always had zoysia grass that survives pretty well, but our cool season is what we normally try to grow. And there's really 5 of them there, but bent grass at the bottom, you don't put bent grass in your home lawns. It's too high maintenance, tremendous amounts of fertilizer and irrigation and fungicides. And so it's just something you wouldn't want to do as a homeowner unless you're retired and have nothing else better to do. And then you can have bent grass, but that's what they have on the golf course greens and the fairways and so forth. But the other 4 there are Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, tall fescue, and fine fescues. And there's a number of different species of the fine fescues. And so, for years and years, it was kind of thought that the Kentucky bluegrass was the premier, the absolute best grass. Even for New Jersey, and it was being promoted even by Rutgers as one most desirable grass. But that's kind of changed, I think. A lot now have kind of moved toward the tall fescues. It's a much deeper rooted grass species. It's more pretty tough grass. It can tolerate a little more drought. It can tolerate a little more shade too. And it's like most of the Kentucky bluegrass cultivars. And so anyway, I mean, for the homeowners here that have lawns, do you even know what type of lawn that you have? Or maybe it's a mixture. It probably is a mixture. Do you even know? Have you looked into that? Anyone care to say? Yeah. It is pesky, as far as the fine fescues? Okay. Oh, the tall fescue. Okay. Oh, good. That's a good choice. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I'm going to be putting some tall fescue in a portion of my lawn. I really want to wait till the fall. I think that's the best time to put in new seed. So, all right. So let's kind of go through this. We were, I saw information just recently, but every decade, these transition zones, every decade are moving about 13 miles north. So when I started with my job, where we are now, say right here in Gloucester, if you go back, be about 35 miles south is where that transition zone, here's the transition zone here. So that line is now about 35 miles further north than it was when I first started with my job in 1995. So about 13 years per decade. And it's going to continue to go up. Everything's moving up, and it's getting warmer. And so that's not apparently going to change in the near future. And so even though now we have a combination of what would be called northern as well as transitional grasses, although we do have the zoysia grass that can survive in New Jersey as well, which is considered to be a southern grass. Okay. So what's really kind of difference between the cool season and the warm season grasses? Well, it's when they grow most, when they're most aggressive. With the cool season grasses, we know we do most of our mowing. What months? Probably May and June. May and June is probably when we get the greatest amount of, well, we have to mow most often. And sometimes a weekly mowing is just not often enough. Maybe needed every 4 or 5 days for, maybe for a few weeks. And then it slows down in the summer. And then it picks back up in the fall, but not as much as it did in the spring. And so you can see growth rate with the y-axis and the time of year and how it kind of peaks around May and early June, I think, for growth rate. And then it does slow down considerably in the summer, late June, July, August months. And then it picks back up again in September, October. Now it's a warm season grasses, it's just the opposite. I mean, they're most vigorous during the summer periods. Okay. And then when we are starting to get our good root growth, especially with our in the fall, and some pretty decent top growth as well with our cool season grasses, then the warm season grasses are really starting to go into early dormancy. You've all seen the zoysia grass when it's October, it's starting to turn brown. When temperatures begin to drop around 50 degrees Fahrenheit or below, the zoysia grass really begins to lose that green color. They're kind of brown, maybe close to 7 months out of the year. And it's part of New Jersey. So let's look at some real quick, easy way to determine species. And let's go with Kentucky bluegrass. And that is, you look at the very tip of the blade, of the leaf blade, and you look for that canoe shape. It's kind of shaped like a boat or like a canoe. So that's an easy way to pick it up. And I think that's one of the simplistic ways to determine if you got the Kentucky bluegrass or not. If they look for that canoe-shaped tip right there at the very end. Okay. And then also one of the best features about Kentucky bluegrass is shown here is the fact that it has underground rhizomes. They're a type of a stem, but they grow underground. Okay, and they're able to spread that way much better than, say, perennial ryegrass, which would be a clump grass, or tall fescue is also a clump grass. Even though they're working on varieties that have a little bit of rhizomes to them, but they've never really got them to the point where they're anything near like Kentucky bluegrass. So when you have voids opening up, so this Kentucky bluegrass, if it's vigorous, they can move in where that void is and start putting these new, what we call daughter plants, just by growing up off those rhizomes that are there. Okay, so that's the best feature about Kentucky bluegrass, are these underground rhizomes, so they can fill in voids pretty quickly. Okay, and maybe prevent weeds from doing it first. Okay. All right, then this kind of just an underground, or rather the underground view from the side as well as the overhead. Where you got the mother plant and then all these daughter plants to the side. You can see how they can spread and fill in the voids pretty quickly. Okay. All right, so they spread by rhizomes. We've already talked about that. That fill in the void, the bare spots well. There's relatively slow germination, and in fact, this is one that, especially if it's a new lawn, I wouldn't try to plant a new Kentucky bluegrass lawn in spring. It would be kind of difficult to get it up and have it to be real vigorous, because you can, just when it's really beginning to maybe grow and develop a halfway decent root system, bam, it gets hit by the heat of the summer. And for the cool season grasses, the heat of summer is a real stress to it. So we prefer to maybe establish a new lawn, in particularly, especially if you're using Kentucky bluegrass, to do it in the fall. That's your best establishment. The thing is, the reason why is that, okay, you got the fall, there's good conditions for it, less insects, less weeds, less, various heat pressures from the heat, the stress. And then they overwinter quite well. They've evolved to overwinter nicely. And then you get another period in the spring that are ideal growing conditions for it. So you really get two good growing conditions before it finally gets hit by that summer period. And by then, hopefully, the grass has become pretty well established. So that's one of the primary reasons why we want to try to establish lawns in the fall period. Okay. All right. All right, some of this stuff I don't need to really spend much time on. It's, I'd say here it's full sun. All of our grasses really prefer the full sun. It's just that some are more tolerant of the shade than others. I mean, of the 4 common cool season grasses, our most shade tolerant is going to be the fine fescues. Tall fescues are not bad as far as its shade tolerant. Perennial ryegrass would more than likely be at least shade tolerant. And then you have many different cultivars, and that's one thing that's kind of been done over the many decades. And Rutgers is one of numerous land-grant universities around the country that do a lot of research with new hybrids and new genetics of turf grasses. And so you have a good variety, even within the same species, of turf grasses that can tolerate different conditions. So it's not too simplistic to say Kentucky bluegrass, is not going to do well in the shade. I mean, there are some varieties that will do better than others, but I want to stress, all grasses really do best in the sun, just that some are more shade tolerant. All right, so, and as far as pH, that's 6 to 6.5 is the general rule. Maybe test your soil every 3 to 5 years is all you really need to do. And many times, I think I'll talk about this. I'm already beginning to talk about things I plan to talk about later, so I can skip them over when I reach it. But, there are some nutrients and elements that the turf maybe just doesn't need. The best example would be phosphorus. Unless you're establishing a new turf and you want to have extra phosphorus, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But sometimes phosphorus, that's why these fertilizer rules have been put into place, because we're oftentimes putting more things like nitrogen and phosphorus than we need to in our soils. They cause contamination of our waterways, our bays and our rivers and our streams and so forth, lakes. Okay, all right, so let's talk about perennial ryegrass, and this is one that sometimes you got to look pretty close for this, but right at the base, at the stem, now these are the blades, and this is the stem, and right there near the soil line, or in this case, it kind of looks like maybe thatch, you have more of a purple coloration. I don't know if some of you ever noticed that with perennial ryegrass. Yeah, that's a kind of a quick, easy way to make the determination. This is a good chance that this is perennial ryegrass. But you see that purple coloration there, okay? And this is an example of perennial ryegrass, which is called a clump grass, as opposed to the spreading grasses, which have the underground rhizomes. We also, I didn't talk about this, we also have above ground stolons that are more common with our warm season turf grasses. I mean, almost all of them. Zoysia grass, St. Augustine grass, oh my gosh. You walk on, probably those of you who know St. Augustine grass, you walk on a grass that's really well established, you feel like you're going to fall over. It's got the underground rhizomes as well as the above ground stolons. And they do make it kind of difficult to walk on a little bit. It's so extensive. So this, how they spread is not through the daughter plants from the rhizomes. In this case, it's just side tillers. So the clump gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it doesn't fill in voids from a distance very, very fast. Okay. All right, so it does, so it spreads by tillers. It's kind of clumpy, and it doesn't have the rhizomes. I keep repeating myself. It does traffic well. What's probably one of the more common sports field grasses we have is the perennial ryegrass. Establishes fast. You put down the seed, and you get germination in just a few days. Okay, and it does tolerate foot traffic pretty well. The thing is, it's a clump grass, and so you don't have it filling in, but so you have to overseed a lot. That's what the athletic fields have to do. Many times they have a combination of different types of mixtures of grasses in those. Okay, they do establish really quick, 5-7 days. Okay, these grasses also have something I'll talk about a little bit more later. They're called endophytes. Maybe some of the commercial guys know this, but Endophytes did not become available. You buy them within grass seed. They're contained in the grass seed. They're a fungi. They first became available in 1990. Because I remember I was at a turf conference, and I even know where I was, Adelphia, which is near Freehold, where I live now, at a research plot. And one of the, I think it was an entomologist there speaking on these endophytes that just became available in 1990. And it's really great because they're insect deterrents. So they prevent things like caterpillars and chinch bugs from feeding on the grass blades because there's a toxin in it from the endophyte fungi. So it doesn't harm the grasses. It helps the grasses. It protects them against feeding, but it kills some of the defeating insects that are a problem for it. So, all right. The key, maybe the worst part of these types of grasses, this species, perennial ryegrass, is that it requires a lot of mowing because it does grow fast, and it needs a lot of fertilizer and a lot of water. So that's why it's a high maintenance turf, like an athletic field. They anticipate, if it's something that's going to be maintained at a high level athletic field, they're anticipating that they're going to have to do a lot of supplemental fertilizer and irrigation and overseeding on a routine basis as the seasons progress. Okay. All right. So just keep moving along here as get through these ID sections and go through some other important cultural practices. Tall fescue. It's one that's probably the easiest to identify only because the blades are fairly wide and they got the very prominent venation that run along the length of the blade. And so that coarse venation is easy to tell that you have a tall fescue. Right? This is one that I tell you, I have to really look close on. Sometimes I can't find it. But apparently, with tall fescue, again, just right at that base of the stem area, near the soil line, that doesn't really show much there, the photograph, but it kind of has a pinkish coloration. I don't know, anyone ever notice that? I mean, it's something I don't use as an ID feature, because I don't know if I have to. When you see tall fescue, you know what it is. For the most part. Fine. And what are their characteristics? Again, it doesn't have any kind of underground rhizome, so it's a tiller type spreading grass. It's a clump grass. And it does wear well. It's a good grass also for athletic fields. It's a very deep-rooted grass, exceptionally deep-rooted. And so it has a good drought tolerance to it. And it does wear quite well. Now, the good thing about this, these new cultivars I was talking about before, is that they're constantly trying to come up with tall fescues that have the thinner type blades. They look pretty attractive, more attractive. When these first came out, there was the old, was it the K31 cultivar that came out, was it maybe in the early 60s or something? It was basically a construction grass. It was designed to put down and to be kind of tough grass, don't have to do anything with it, and it would help prevent erosion with a deep root system. But it wasn't very attractive for lawns, but some people tried it in their home lawns, and it was K31. But that's something you wouldn't want to do because we have much better cultivars than what they were first when they first came out, these tall fescues. And so, all right. So yeah, it's a good tough grass. And I bet you're very pleased with your tall fescue. You don't have to worry about it too much. Yeah, you maybe fertilize it once or twice a year, And do you even need to irrigate it? You have an irrigation system? Oh, it's a retirement community. So it's out of your hands. Yeah. And oftentimes they overwater it there, maybe every day for 15 minutes. And so they promote a shallow root system. But tall fescues, they want to be a deep root. They really do. Okay. All right. As far as insects and disease, not too much there either, except for there's one called brown patch that's notorious to get on tall fescue. And so that's maybe one disease you need to worry about. Or if you're a commercial turf manager and you occasionally have to be responsible for preventing diseases. Brown patch is one to look out for with the tall fescue. Okay, and that can be a difficult disease to diagnose sometimes. Brown patch, basically at the beginning, just the general thinning, and over time it gets worse and worse. But I'm not going to be talking any detail about turf diseases today. Okay, that's a whole different talk. All right. So yeah, part shade, it does better in part shade as well. It does pretty well. Not as well as the fine fescues. So, you know, another difference between the warm season grasses and the cool season grasses, overall, the cool season grasses can be a bit better as far as their shade tolerance than the warm season grasses. So the best shade tolerance of the cool or the warm season grasses would be St. Augustine grass. That's the best shade tolerance. And maybe you notice sometimes with the zoysia grass, you'll have a shaded of a tree, and you won't have many of the zoysia grass growing underneath the shade. You'll have more cool season grasses because they're more competitive in the shade. And so as the zoysia came in, and oftentimes it comes as an invader from maybe the neighbor across adjacent to the property, unless you planted it yourself. But they'll come in and they'll just creep in, and they can kind of start taking over what was there with the cool season grasses. But under the shade of a tree, they're not as competitive because they like more sun. So the cool season grasses can probably beat them back. And they're showing you here, this is the old K31 there. It's not a really great photograph, but you can see it was kind of a pale coloration, very coarse in appearance. And this is an old slide. This is probably a slide from the 90s or something. But this is showing you an improved variety of a cultivar of the tall fescue species. And it looks better colored and a thinner blade, so it looks more attractive. It's really good for home lots. Now the trouble is that if you do have a more of a thick blade on some of the varieties of the tall fescues, they don't mix well. Let's say certainly not fine fescues, but even the other two, perennial ryegrass or the Kentucky bluegrass, maybe the blade difference in width is too much of a contrast, so they don't mix well. And so this showing you, I think right in this area is where the tall fescue, kind of a clump grass, and then surrounding it is maybe probably I think maybe Kentucky bluegrass, and it kind of doesn't look too good. It's a little bit too much of a contrast between the two. So fine fescue, the last one we're going to talk about, I think, as far as ID features, and again, kind of an easy one to determine because the blade or the leaf of the fine fescue is exceptionally thin. It's the only one where the blades are thinner than the stem, as shown here. You can see, yeah, look at all the stems, stem right here, considerably thicker than the blades. And some say that the fine fescue has similar, maybe like angel hair, very, very thin. It's an attractive looking grass. It can do pretty well in the shade, and it doesn't need a lot of mowing. It doesn't need a lot of fertilizer. And but the thing is, the negative part is that it's not wear tolerant. It doesn't tolerate a lot of traffic. So if you're, I have in my yard, I've got some big green ash trees that I'm protecting in the emerald ash borer. And the shade now is really starting to get pretty high. And what I have growing there is Kentucky bluegrass, and it's really starting to thin out pretty badly underneath the trees. So I probably should put a mulch of some kind underneath there. But I thought about putting fine fescue, and maybe it would be okay. But it's not something I'm going to be walking on very much, and so as far as wear tolerance, that shouldn't be a problem. But even there's a point where that shade of the tree, as the trees, there's three of them, as they get bigger and bigger, and the shade continues to get more, that even fine fescue has its limit. I probably should go with a ground cover underneath the trees. Okay. So just the close-up of the blades versus the stem. Okay, that's one that's, I think, and once you realize what to look for and its characteristics, most of these cool season turf grasses are pretty quick to identify. You don't need to get the hand guns out unless you really want to, maybe not sure about something, then you can verify. But normally, just looking at these just macro characteristics without the use of a hand lens, it's going to be fine. Okay. So yeah, I've already pretty much talked about this. There are different species of fescue, or as the genus of the fine fescue. There's a number of different ones. There's what, 3 of them listed there. They do have the creeping red fescue. One nice feature about that, it does have some rhizomes, underground rhizomes. So it's a bit of a similar to Kentucky bluegrass, but it's nowhere near as vigorous as Kentucky bluegrass with the rhizomes. All right. So perennial ryegrass, the most demanding of fertilizer and water and sun is the perennial ryegrass species. And this was a plot, 2 plots right next to each other at one of the Rutgers research field days a good number of years ago. And what they did with each of these 2 plots, the one on the left was a fine fescue called hard fescue, was this actual species. Then one on the right was a perennial ryegrass, and they just let these, they let it go. They planted it, they got the grass blades up, and they didn't do anything else to either of these. The size is about 3 foot by 5 foot in size, and you can see what happened to perennial ryegrass. Just totally couldn't survive. Whereas the hard fescue did look a little small area toward the top, but most of it looked pretty good. There was nothing done to it, and it was able to survive for the most part. Well, actually, at the bottom, it was more of a problem. I don't know what happened there. All right, as already indicated, bentgrass. Has anyone ever, maybe I can just bring it out to anybody. Has anyone attempted to grow bentgrass in your yard? Any avid golfers going to have your own putting green? Wow, yeah, this is one that would pretty good expense to maintain it and a lot of attention. That's why the golf course superintendents get paid. Some of them, if it's an upper end golf course, they get paid 6-figure salaries. They get paid pretty well. Keep this stuff alive, and they have to have a pretty thorough education of how to do it. So, all kinds of fertilizer and irrigation and fungicides and so forth. So, all right, so high maintenance for golf course. Not going to do that for home lawns. And wow, what happened here? This is the most common. I think maybe red thread might be the more common one, but dollar spot is right there next to it. It's 102. And this is on a golf course practice putting green. And for some reason, maybe they did it on purpose, the golf course. They got this dollar spot present and they didn't do anything about it. Maybe they're going to completely re-renovate it, would be my guess. Or if not, then this fellow up here is probably working in the fast food industry now. So I don't know. Not to speak negatively of the fast food industry. You still got to know what you're doing. So, all right. Yeah, that's what dollar spot looks like on a putting green. That's dollar spot is given that name because it's similar to the size of a silver dollar, at least initially, just a couple inches in diameter on the bent grass. And home lawns, dollar spot would be 4 or 5, 6 inches in diameter. Okay. All right, so this is the maintenance requirements of our cool season grasses. There they are. And the highest, of course, is bent grass. We don't want to do that. And then the fine fescues will probably be the least maintenance required. Yeah. My favorite turf grass is definitely tall fescue. I've become a convert. You know, when Rutgers in the 80s and the 90s, I think especially in the 80s, they did a lot of work with Kentucky grasses. And they were known nationally, if not internationally, as some of the best breeding being done with our cultivars of Kentucky bluegrass. So obviously they're going to really promote that species of turfgrass to the industry. But now they've kind of taken a back seat now. Tall fescue is oftentimes maybe the better choice, at least in some areas. So, yeah, I know there's one convert. What about the commercial guys? Do you kind of agree with that statement for the most part? Tall fescue has a lot of good desirable features to it. And so, yeah, okay. Okay, all right, that's kind of a fun slide. Zoysia grass is definitely invasive. This was early April. You can see the grass where the zoysia was located in this front yard. And you know where the zoysia is because it's still brown. Or in this photograph, it looks actually white. And then there's the summer. July looks good. Yeah, blends in beautifully. Can't even tell. And then by the time you get to October, it's starting to change again. So yeah, temperatures about 50 degrees and below, you really begin to start seeing that browning taking place with zoysia grass. Any fans of zoysia grass here? Yeah, there's some people who really like it. And I think maybe one of the better places for it is along the shore coast, especially if it's a summer home. You know, you like that green grass in the summer period when you're going to be there mostly, but during the winter, maybe you don't care what it looks like. Yeah. How do you kill it? Well, there are some herbicides that are available that can be somewhat selective if you got, I mean, for the most part, though, zoysia is going to be where you have zoysia, that's what the grass is. It's going to be zoysia grass because it's really so invasive and it's so vigorous and it chokes out everything else. There's not much that can grow through zoysia grass with a couple of exceptions. Onion grass and garlic grass, you can see the spikes of those weeds kind of sticking through the thatch. But yeah, there's, I mean, you know, if you're in a residential area, you can't burn it. You're not allowed to do that. But you know, some people do that. If you're in a kind of back rural area, you can burn it. It's very dry in the wintertime, and it can burn pretty well. To make sure it's controlled. Yeah. That's. You done the burning?
No.
Oh, you've killed it with herbicide, or you just dug it out?
No, herbicide.
Yeah.
We should just spray it with water.
Okay. Did you just use a non-selective herbicide like glyphosate? Oh, probably glyphosate. Yeah. Roundup.
Yeah, it was Roundup. I just used it straight.
Yeah.
Then I dug it out.
They do, yeah.
I dug it out.
I know. Yeah. So, but you like it?
Well, I like it because I don't wanna, I kind of wanna go more.
Less maintenance.
Well, less maintenance, but also because of the environment. I don't fertilize it, I don't
No, you don't have to.
water it.
No.
I don't really have weeds.
Yeah.
So the only problem I have with it is that if I want to put in a flower bed, you have to kind of, like you said, because it is invasive, it kind of will creep into the flower bed.
Yeah,
So
this
it's
one-
kind of pulling that out.
This one has both the underground rhizomes and the above ground stolons.
So that's
pretty
the only
vigorous.
problem if I want to put in more flower beds. It's
Yeah, my dad, I remember I was 10 years old, moving to a new place in Bridgewater, Somerset County up north. And my dad wanted to plant this new grass that was being advertised as the miracle grass, which was zoysia grass. And so we got these sprigs or plugs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was out there with my dad planting them. I don't know, we did a pretty good section of the backyard. It was a half-acre yard we had, so we definitely didn't do that much. But, you know, maybe, I don't know if it was 5,000 square feet or something like that. And it's funny because I will go back to that home now. And I knew it was, we only lived there for 7 years, and we moved, but I could see it spread, moving out. Today, I go and visit. It has spread through the backyard and around the sides is now moving toward the front yard.
Yeah, I know
But that's
all the
been-
seams of the concrete.
It's been, you know, 55 years.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't fertilize and I don't have to
Yeah.
put, you know, herbicides down, so
Yeah.
I'm all about that.
Sometimes you can lose, you can have neighbor disputes developing. You have an invasive zoysia grass.
Well, I'd rather have that. than
Yeah.
chemicals.
Yeah, so just showing you the above ground, in this case, I think it's the stolen, above ground stolen. All right, I mentioned before, wild garlic and onion grass can penetrate through that thick, it does have a lot of thatch to it.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
you know, I wanted to say that because some of my neighbors have it, and they actually burn their,
Yeah,
and you said you're not allowed, that's illegal?
I think there's certain, you know, local ordinances that would prohibit that in residential areas. You have to look into
Yeah,
what's permitted.
yeah, I mean, I've never done it, but I've
Yeah.
seen it kind of takes up the thatch.
Yeah. You might get out of control.
What?
It might get out of control. And
Well, yeah, I
I
don't
know.
do it, I mean, I
Yeah.
just told some
you
people,
would be careful.
yeah.
Okay. Now, this is the St. Augustine grass. I wanted to show you, again, one of the above ground stolons of that. Good close up of it. And you can look at all the individual daughter plants along the entire length. In this case, these are stolons and not the rhizomes, although it does have both. But it'll produce daughter plants on both types of stems, either the stolons or
Is
the
that more
rhizomes.
invasive than this, I'm sure they got.
Is it more basic, you said?
Is it invasive?
Oh, is it more invasive? Well, it depends upon the site. Of course, it wouldn't survive in the north. This is a true summer.
Yeah.
It's, in fact, it's called the shade grass of the south. It can tolerate, it's of all the warm, like I said, of all the warm season grasses, zoysia, St. Augustine grass is the most shade tolerant. Yeah. Again, when my mom was alive in Florida,
It's
Get
not
it.
pretty, is it?
it's very coarse, and when you walk on it, as I said, you feel like you're gonna fall over. It's very thick. But anyway, yeah, my mom had this when her home down near Orlando, Florida, when she was alive, and we had a huge live oak tree. Took up most of her entire front yard, and even this grass was beginning to thin because
Oh,
the shade was getting too much for it. So it was a limit.
well, that's one way to get rid of these grasses, right?
Shade.
A lot
Well,
of
there are ways
trees
you
on
can
the
kill
property.
grass. Yeah, that's kind of a slow way to do it. So how are these designs made? But where is this location? What stadium are we at there? Yes, I heard it. Wrigley Field, Chicago. Cubs. And I was born in Chicago. Before they actually won it at 16, I always would say, yeah, my dad influenced me because my parents grew up in Chicago. My dad influenced me to be a Cubs fan. And I always say, you know, that was child abuse. Because they had awful teams for many, many years. But yeah, they're starting to have a downslope again, but they had a good team for a good several years. And so how are these designs made? I think this is primarily made, maybe some of you who know more about it than I do, primarily perennial ryegrass. And the way that they bend the blade when they mow. Because the one side of perennial ryegrass have a silver type coloration to it. Anyone want to disagree with me there? This is what I've been told years ago, and I always assumed whoever told me knew what they were talking about. So you mow it one direction, and you get the growth taking place, and you get that silver coloration. Do it the other direction, and it's more of a darker color tone to it. That's how the designs are made, and it's mostly done with the perennial ryegrass. These are the most contrast to the two, between the two. You make pretty extensive designs. People make it. Same thing here. Yeah. Okay. All right. I think for the sake of time, I want to move through this. I kind of already talked about it a little bit, as far as, you know, there's different mixtures, and when you have two or more species, distinct species of a turf grass, that's called a mixture. So I have a Kentucky bluegrass and say and a tall fescue or common ryegrass. You mix those two together, it's called a mixture. Now, if you have the same species of grass but have different cultivars or varieties, that's called a blend. That's the difference. And the reason why, if you're going to have just a single species of turf grass, it's always been stated minimum you have at least 3 different varieties to have a blend. Maybe some would say 5 would even be better. Because if you get a problem with one of the particular varieties of cultivars, it won't affect the entire. Maybe another variety would be okay. Whatever this, maybe it's a disease, oftentimes would be more severe on one than another, or some kind of environmental situation that one cultivar can have better survivability than another. So you don't lose your entire turf. You don't want to put down just one single species with one variety, and then if a problem develops, the whole turf might be wiped out. So to help avoid that, you have either different mixtures with different species, or you have a variety of blends. So that's one way to help with that. I said this is all different environmental conditions that would depend upon. This is what the breeding people at Rutgers who are producing these new cultivars or variety. There's, by the way, there's thousands of different varieties that have been produced with our turf grasses. And they will often test to see which of these types of potential stresses or environmental conditions they will thrive or have more problems with, depending upon the variety that it is. So this is how they determine which is maybe the best species and variety for you to use at a certain site based on what it's going to be up against and what kind of stresses it might have a problem. So that's how they provide all these different choices for you. And this is when it takes a lot of effort to try to determine on a certain site which establish a new turf. What is going to be your best choices of seed and species as well as different varieties. So you make all these considerations you take into determine the choice that you make by looking at these different site conditions. Okay. All right. Okay, I'll move through here. I want to talk about that. And so, for example, improving stress tolerances, all those diseases, insect, shade, wear, drought, lower fertility, mowing, temperature. You choose a variety and a species that's going to survive those conditions, whatever they happen to be, best. Okay. And then also, of course, you look at the aesthetics of it as well, the color, and the texture, uniformity, growth habit. So all these come into play. So it can get quite involved, maybe more so than most of us would want to even bother taking. And if you want to get your very best potential turf, the more you learn and make the best decisions, the better overall your turf might become in the future. Right, and so this showing you here, for example, our Kentucky bluegrass, this is the turf nomenclature binomial system. This is a Kentucky bluegrass. The genus is POA. The species is Pratensis. And then you have, for example, different types of cultivars, which are usually in single quotes. If you look at it. So this is some of the mixtures you might recommend as far as if you're going with different species. And this is showing you some of the percentages that have worked well for people in the past. But sometimes you can experiment with it and you kind of get an idea what's best, what has worked best for you in the past. This is someone, if you're a commercial turf grass manager and you do a lot of new grass establishment for residential sites, you probably put in a lot of research and determination of what's going to be best. And maybe in some areas we have different mixtures than in others, depending upon if it's a dry site, it's a wetter site, it's shade or sun. So there's many variables, that combinations that come into play that can be a little bit mind-boggling, I guess. But, you know, you do, the more effort you put into it, the better things become. All right, so this is showing you germination times of their different species. The slowest growing would be the Kentucky bluegrass, 21 to 28 days. This is why it's kind of difficult to establish a Kentucky bluegrass in the spring. You're going to put down a grass in the spring, a new turf establishment. And you're going to get your best results. Probably going to go with perennial ryegrass because it comes up so quick. Even though it's going to hit that summer heat and it's going to maybe knock it back a bit. That's why it's usually always best to, as I say, fall season is best. Okay. All right. And this is the reason why fall is better than spring. Yeah. You know, it's funny because you see advertising out there every spring. You know, the advertisers, you know, time to put all the effort into your lawns. You know? The weeds are here, which is true, and the insects and the diseases, and you gotta put down the new grass seed, and maybe, you know, there's a place for that in the spring, but you really should probably focus most of your efforts in the fall when you do with new grass establishment. Anyone disagree with that? I don't know, how many of you have done much with, I'm talking commercial or some homeowners, have you done much in the way of turf establishment on your operations, your clients, or at your home sites? Many of you done much? Because I don't see any hands. So, yeah, you've done. Oh, you have. Okay. Yeah.
My daughter had that.
Which one? Zoysia grass. Yeah. Moles. Yeah.
Now, is there anything?
Well, moles are often there because of things like earthworms. Yeah. Yeah. Or maybe grubs. Yeah. And yeah. The moles are their problem is they aerate the soil but excessively, and so they dry out the roots because the tunnels they make, and the roots dry out and they raise up the soil.
So there's nothing.
Well, I mean, there's ways you can maybe. Yeah. Well, there's baits that you can put in the tunnels. How effective they are. And there's traps and so forth. Trapping is probably the most effective, but it's time consuming. Yeah. What do you do? Well, what we've just been talking about, there's baits and there's traps. And, you know, you can attempt, you know, see the thing is earthworms are good. They're beneficial for the soil. They aerate it and they give nutrients from the lower and down up to the top of where the roots are. Yeah, I think maybe it's for the long term, but probably trapping would be the most effective. I don't know, baits can work as well. I mean, you hear these old wives' tales, things like chewing gum and that kind of thing. I don't know how effective that is. I've heard it. Yeah, trapping. Okay. Yeah, I can see why that would be effective. Maybe it's just have to take some time. Yeah. Maybe one good thing, if you have a lot of white grubs in your turf, get rid of the white grubs. Yeah. Oh, yeah, they love grubs. Fat juice. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. So, all right. So yeah, just showing you some of the reasons why the fall is the better time. I think that's self-explanatory. I don't need to talk about this. All right, let's talk, and then I don't. What's the time, Harry? Probably go a little bit longer yet. So 10:30's half? So can we go 15 more minutes? I don't know if I can. Endophytes. This is what I started talking about earlier. And this is kind of an interesting story with endophytes. You know, and during the westward movement, a lot of it was taking place in the 1840s. going across the prairies of the country. Many of them were, their goal, for at least early on, was California, with the gold rush and that type of thing. But as they would bring, their cattle with them and their horses and their wagons, it was a long journey. It took months across the country. And one thing they noticed as they were getting some parts of the country with the grasses and the cattle and the horses were feeding on the grasses, and they became ill. And they assumed that correctly that there was something that was in the grass that was toxic to them. They didn't know that there was what we now call endophytes, which is a fungi. They didn't know that. They called it sleepy grass, the term that was often used. And it didn't kill the animals, but it made them sick, so they couldn't really move maybe for a day or two until they recovered. And they had to try to prevent them from eating the grass in that area, apparently. And so this is what was discovered, that these endophytes, and they already knew about them later on as the decades went. They were aware that these endophytes exist in certain turf grasses. And so what was discovered, though, is that they were able to isolate these fungi and inoculate the seeds of our desirable cool season grasses. Not Kentucky bluegrass, but the other ones they could. Perennial ryegrass, all fescue, and then the fine fescue, they could inoculate seed that would contain these endophytes. And so when insects, not white grubs, because the endophytes are not in the roots, these fungi are only in the stems or in the blades of the grass, or right there near the crown, apparently. When those insects I talked about, such as chinch bugs or bluegrass bill bugs or a saw webworm, when they would feed on these grasses containing endophytes, we'd kill them. So it was a great insect deterrence. And so that's why these endophytes are one of the best biocontrols we've ever done. And it usually works pretty well. But they never have been able to successfully inoculate the Kentucky bluegrass. I don't know if they're still working on it. I remember I've asked some of the Rutgers research turf professors, I mean, is any more research being done in that area trying to inoculate the Kentucky bluegrass? And they said, well, there's maybe occasional isolated research here and there, but the reason is it's hard to get money for that kind of funding because the chance for success is so low. And so they can't get grant money for it. That's why apparently if there's going to be any research, it's going to be done by a multi-billionaire or something. All right, so these are the endophytes, and they're actually a symbiotic with the plant, and they grow between the cells of the leaf blades or the stems. Okay, and so they don't infect the grasses, and they don't negatively infect the grasses. So it's a benefit to them because of the insect deterrence. You can see these fungal mycelium, kind of this reddish coloration, that's growing between the cells of this leaf blade shown here. So when these insects come and they feed on that fungi, it kills them. Okay. And this is not a great photograph, but showing you endophytes with and without. I guess the one on the left shows what it was. It's one of these Rutgers experiments with these 3-foot by 5-foot plots. Some of the commercial guys been to these turf field days? Yeah, they try to have them once every year in July. And so they have all these types of research that they demonstrate and show. But this is one of them. I don't know what it was feeding. I think I would assume maybe it was chinch bugs or something that was feeding on this, but it wasn't feeding on the one on the right. Okay. All right, so let's talk about what we have left here. And tell you what, why don't, since this is kind of a break in the transition, why don't we go ahead and take what, 10 minutes, 15 minutes? Yeah, why don't we do that? Okay, sounds good.
talking about like the cat one.
Yeah, and I tried to see a dog or I guess a cat as well, though.
Yeah.
Usually it's because of their, I don't know why they do that. I've heard theories of why they're
Go out,
feeding,
Yeah,
but, yeah, I mean, it potentially could harm them,
okay.
yeah.
I mean, I don't have it. I
That's,
did
you know,
have a
if you
cat.
have,
And I've had a cat that used to go out sometimes. He'd come in and-
yeah, I didn't, actually explain what this photo was about. If you have grazing animals
Really?
and you have a known field of grass that contain endophytes, you don't want them feeding on the turf. The same thing with goats or sheep
Right.
or horses.
Yeah, because a lot of
Yeah.
places they send
I-
out
that-
goats to.
The thing is, now these animals can consume tremendous amounts. Now, someone like a cat or a dog, just
They should be
dwindling a little
careful,
bit.
yeah.
So I don't know if it would have too much of a negative impact on that. My guess would be no. Because maybe it requires a fairly high consumption.
Yeah, because, like you said, they're actually.
Doesn't kill even the big, it doesn't kill the big animals, just makes them ill, you know, for,
Yeah, cattle just
12
go out and munch
12
on it.
hours
It's
or
not like
more.
it's like crazy.
yeah. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Although a veterinarian may advise you differently.
I don't have a cat now, but I know I used to have a cat that went out and would.
Yeah,
eat
well,
the
I
grass
dog
and
would do
come in
that
and Throw out,
on a.
yeah, the dogs
Dog
would do
would do
that.
And I always thought that the dog was upset about something. And I don't know.
Oh, okay, I always thought that they had it rejected, it digested.
Maybe, yeah.
They were eating the grass and trying to settle themselves. I don't know, I was guessing, but I was just wondering.
Now, the grass that my dog lives in the 70s, and so it wasn't until the 90s when commercial turf land. So my dog lived in the 60s and 70s. So probably the turf grasses she ate on didn't even contain anything. But it's very common now today. You have a lawn, especially one that's
Well,
been
that's what I
seeded more recently. I think unless the seed on the bag says so, almost all the new seed, except for the Kentucky bluegrass, are going to be endophyte enhanced. They'll say right on the bag, endophyte enhanced. And so it's generally it's expected. That's what
What do they say, like, keep away from the animals on these animals, or everything like
I don't know what the warning says. Maybe they'll have it. Yeah.
What is that?
Well, that's anyone who's basically takes care of turf. I mean, they could be very extensive in their in what they do. Probably requires a lot of education. Some of them maybe just primarily motor. And they occasionally will put herbicides back.
So if I have a guy who does my lawn and he does, put fertilizer.
No, well, fertilizer, you have to have a license. You have to have a fertilizer license. Yeah, that changed. That was 2015. Where New Jersey had a fertilizer
So
law.
that should give you a lot of time. Have to have-
Yes, commercial
You have a landscape.
commercial
landscape
managers
Okay.
have to have a license to apply fertilizer to their clients. Wow.
Most of your field striping is all done with kits on machines.
Yeah, kind of the real mower.
No, just even regular mowers, it's like if we all use almost all of them, maybe they're flat on the bottom. It will, like you said, pull it one way, the other way,
Yes.
either have a flat, a roller or something.
And so,
And honestly, I don't think that I think that's the.
is that right?
If you look at Medway,
Yeah.
fucking turf supplies are, and that's, they're either giving them their sports mix.
Okay.
I think that was bluegrass based.
So it's a variety of species that can produce that striping based
Like I
on.
said, it's mainly just the.
And
the
so-
themselves. So like most guys have like,
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah.
A lot of them are just, you know. just like
I've been spreading that misinformation for a long time. And I got it for someone who I thought was credible.
Right,
And maybe he primarily worked with carnivore grass,
Yeah, and it
and it
is
did
more-
work for him.
It's more the.
Yeah.
And it, but I think honestly, we'll have a long strike nicer.
Yeah,
Kentucky and all
well,
this more beautiful.
Even a home rotary mower, you go one direction and the other, you can see the difference in the shape.
If you look at maybe almost, I'll have that.
Yeah.
Flat back, it's that
Oh,
flat pulling drag.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of cool.
Which I know that it wouldn't require a real mower to give that effect. But even though most of the,
Like I said, most of the flat one.
Yeah.
It's behind.
oh, I'm glad you re-educated me on that. 'Cause I- You know, that's what I asked, because I was never positive about that.
They have guys that do literally go on and cut it in the zigzag pattern.
Oh, they put an intricate designs. Wow.
It's
Beautiful.
I
You
think,
know, sometimes when you're right on level, you don't necessarily appreciate it. You're right higher.
yeah, I mean, when you see diamonds, because they literally cut the lines this way and that way, and you have 4 different shades you could pull and push in different directions. So depending on, you know, because you'll see a lot of diamond patterns,
Yeah.
especially the ball fields.
Yeah. I gotta ask more questions.
Actually, somebody said that works for one of the colleges from the broadcast one direction. For
Just about any higher level upper athletic field does this.
yeah, you'll see like a lot of times they'll have 10 yards dark and the next 10 yards are light. That's
Yeah.
all. You know, they goes down. come
Good to
back,
learn.
and- yeah,
Thank you.
it's just-
Thank you very much.
which is pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really consider myself to be, my expertise is more entomology with ornamentals.
Right.
But, you know, I've just learned enough to get myself in trouble with turf. Yeah. But thank you for that. Yeah. I'll continue to ask more questions to the audience.
There you go.
And, get back to, the people.
You heard anything from Jim in 2 years? or-
Yeah, I saw Jim, he's retired now.
Okay.
Yeah, he retired from the National Botanical Garden,
Okay.
which was just adjacent to Washington, the Capitol in Washington. He lives not too far from Memphis.
Okay.
I had lunch with him a couple of times last summer. I had a Christmas tree farm that I would monitor.
Okay.
And on 2 occasions, I called him and says, hey, you got to have lunch. He's got all the time in the world. He's retired.
There you go.
So he says, "Look, call me." He's actually a few years younger than I am, so he's retired.
Great.
I'm gonna go to 7.
There you go. Keep up with the credit.
They make it in the oh, well, yeah, I mean, I hear a lot of occasions, every time I go to speak, they discuss. Yeah. Sure. 13 miles every 10 years. Yeah, it's not a problem.
The older part. So they found a lot of problems. I mean, I'm happy.
Now that they.
When they trying to landscape piece, trying to transition from the bluegrass, so
Yeah.
they're starting to oversee with it.
I think that's been a trend now. For at least the past 25 years. It's all Christian. People are realizing what diversion is. And they're beginning to move away. Also, we have very attractive grass. Great swimming boys too. That's why they were working on it. Trying to develop a wine zone. With their eye, and they developed one, but it was so weak that it's not worth it. If it doesn't do much. And I think they've kind of given up on that. I'm gonna grab a cup of coffee. And sit down. Yeah.
John Deere.
Okay, good. I'm gonna take the end of. I wanted to sit down for a couple minutes. Can you give me 1 minute? Okay.
So we did have someone speak on insect diseases and journal over Zoom.
Right, right.
That's good.
Yeah, we had a couple people, houseplants, resort insects.
Sure. Okay, I will. Well, yes, in some ways it is, but it's superior. It's a superior mode as far as it's something that golf course. Modes on golf course.
But it's the design.
Correct. It's not a rotary, it works rotating disc. Very sharp blades and gives you the best balance. You can, with that type of mold, very close. That's why if you're cutting bank grass, you may go under a 1/4 inch cutting. Some do. No. Well, you know, if you have a small front yard or some backyard, you can buy one of those pan push. Real walls. I don't know how well that would work this way. It would sink down because of the thickness of it. It has, you know, the stolons as well as the rhizomes, and it does develop fast. Bad attachments. That's probably the biggest negative associated with the fact that it loses starch. Then it allows things like chitch bugs, soggy up ones to come in. Well, I'm sure they can feed on each other grass as well. You have not. Yeah, you often don't. And now, if it's not growing vigorously, you may not develop that much starch. And when you cut it, you probably could just leave the clippings on grass.
Well, that's the thing, I had somebody come and I just think the company,
That will give you additional boost in that.
yeah.
So you can cut. I have a listing of cutting heights for the various species. I don't know if I have a listed down. I'm sure the correct cutting height for associated. Yeah. You start seeing the runners too. They're above ground or stones. They're stems. Below ground or stones. Cool season grasses. Kentucky bluegrass is the one with undergrass. But we don't have that. Our cool season grasses. Oh, we really have to above ground stones. These plant grasses.
grass.
Yes. Too much maintenance for a homeowner. Well, I didn't know how long it did. In fact, we did for reasons. We had a croquet club. It was. Where was that? Was it Belmar? Spring Lake.
Oh,
Right on the coast, Ocean Avenue, definitely a lot of money. And they don't have any. Either a new owner came in, they don't have any. There was a croquet club. They played croquet.
so is that back there?
Not necessarily.
So it seems like it looks
Well, the reason why is it's such a, like a car.
so they put some big on the down so long. Okay. But it rains.
I mean, if you don't mow that grass, probably at least 10 inches, it doesn't look good. Usually, golf courses, it's a quarter inch or less. Not 3 cents. Them grasses. Putting. Oh, no question. It's more than a minute, isn't it? All right, we're going to talk about these items next and go through them, I think, pretty quick. Most of them are things that homeowners maybe make a mistake about. They feel that perhaps it's something they've learned in their earlier years and they think they're doing the right thing, but they maybe not. But I don't want to implicate them for doing a wrong thing before maybe they are doing correctly. But that's one of the mowing is one of the common ones that are missed inappropriately done by homeowners. We were just talking about that with a tendency for homeowners who do their own mowing is to simply cut too short, yeah, and to collect their clippings. Now, if you're commercial, many times they demand that you collect clippings, and so you're kind of your hands may be tied. But leaving clippings is often a benefit to the turf. We'll talk about that and some of these other items like fertilization. The big three, of course, are the nitrogen, the phosphorus, potassium. And now we have our new fertilizer laws, and commercial applicators have to have a license, a New Jersey fertilizer license now. It's been in place for at least 8 years, I believe. And then we'll talk about pH and what that's all about, and liming, and then watering the turf. Another thing that's often incorrectly done by too many homeowners. They're just simply watering insufficiently or not at the right time. And then we'll talk about, as we finish up, things like aeration and then thatch management and what that's all about. Okay, so why grasses can be mowed, as opposed if you can't, obviously, you can't go in and start cutting trees near the soil line. They're not going to grow back. At least most trees will not. Maybe some shrubs will. But the reason why is that grasses, the crown or the growing point is right there near the soil or near the thatch perhaps. And then we're cutting above that, hopefully, unless you're scalping it, then you might be cutting into the crown or too low and it can damage the turf, extensively. But that's wise because we're cutting above the growing point of the turf grasses, which is the crown. And so that's why we cut our grasses pretty low, okay? And then therefore, this is a common rule we have, a rule of thumb is that you want to cut no more at a single cutting, more than a third. Some say up to 40%. So 33% to 40% is where you want to do your cutting, and no more than that. So if it's a 4 inches, you don't want to go in there and cut 2.5 inches off the turf. You maybe want to do it successively over a 2-3 week period to get down to a more manageable, maybe 2.5 inch or so. All right. And so here's as I was just showing you here, 30 to 40% is what you want to try to go. And the 1/3 rule is a good thing to remember. So cut no more than 1/3 of your turf. So you leave 2/3 and you cut 1/3. Okay. And that means that some of our species and what these grass levels are ideal for proper cutting heights. This is kind of a range of things. Tall fescue, cut it pretty high. Yeah. 2.5, 3.5 inches even. That's ideal for turf, tall fescue. And then Kentucky bluegrass, yeah, you can get it down to about 2 inches, but you probably don't want to go much beyond that or lower than that. So 2 to 3 inches is what's often done. Perennial ryegrass, the same thing. And then the fine fescues, you can get a little bit lower. You can go down about 1.5 and maybe 2.5. But then you have, we're speaking also about creeping bent grass or some of the bent grass on golf courses. And you cut that down. In fact, if you need to cut bent grass at least down to about 1/2 inch, or it doesn't look very attractive. And then golf courses cut it even below 1/4 inch on some of their putting greens or their tee areas, or in some cases their fairways leading up to the green. You might have bent grass growing there too. You cut that really low, at least 1/4 inch or lower oftentimes. So that's the trouble is that maybe there's a tournament coming up with the golf course and they want to have fast greens and they'll cut down to 5/32 of an inch. And then you start kind of really pushing it as far as what kind of a problem is going to be occurring on your bent grass when you cut that low. And then you might be encouraging another problem developing. And you're really coming down to want that fast roll of the ball. You might create problems with the bent grass. So this is just showing you the proper cutting height, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the first 3 are okay. And then that 4th one, you get simply cut too low because you remove all the leaves and all you have is just a little stump of a stem. So that grass is going to be, maybe not kill it because you didn't cut into the crown. You didn't scalp it that low, but to the point where the grass is going to be stunted for a rather extended period of time. And the roots are not going to grow at all, and that they may try to begin to grow some blades again, but it's going to take a while, and so you don't want to cut that low. Probably the biggest problem with cutting the grass too short is that you begin to open it up. Voids start to occur. And what's gonna oftentimes be the first one to fill in the voids are gonna be the weeds. Certain types of weeds will fill in very quick. And then also when you cut too low, the roots are stunted rather for an extended period of time. So the grass is stressed severely when you cut too low. And so just showing you again, the higher the cut, the deeper the roots, and showing you there the lower cut, you have more shallow roots. Pretty simple to remember that. Okay. And there's another diagram or line drawing indicating the cutting height versus the growth of depth of the roots. And it's pretty close to symmetry, shallow cut, shallow roots, low cut, shallow roots, and just the reverse. So, pretty easy to understand. Okay. I'm just showing this old research showing you the turf defoliation effects and what happens when you cut beyond that 40%. Things really start going wrong to the grass. And, you don't have much root growth at all for sometimes weeks. So I had a brother, not a brother, but a nephew. Unfortunately, his father died at a young age. So he was the oldest in the family and the only boy in the family. And so my sister said, well, now it's up to you to cut the lawn. And they had a big lawn, they had 3 acres. And he didn't have it. And my brother-in-law he loved his turf. And he spent a lot of time with it. And he enjoyed cutting it too. He had a very expensive riding mower. And he just put a lot of time and money into it. And the turf was beautiful. Well, his son, he was young too. I mean, he was about 10 years old, 11 years old. Does he want to cut a grass? I don't think so. And so it didn't take long for that 10-year-old brain to think, wow, if I cut this grass nice and short, I don't have to cut it as much. And so sure enough, that's what he did. I mean, I lived 200 miles away, so I wasn't there to help much. And I don't think my sister was aware of what he was doing. But by the end of that season, they had probably as much weeds as they did grass. And suddenly he had to cut the grass even more because the weeds were growing faster than the grass. So what a mess. And so he learned his lesson. He did raise the blade some, but he never learned to like it though. And I'm showing you here, has the 1/3 rule been violated with this photograph? Yeah. This was a shot I took outside when I worked my first 7 years, I was at the Ocean County Agricultural Building in Toms River. And this happened every spring. I mean, they couldn't get out because they had such an extensive amount that the township had such number of public areas, they couldn't get around to many of them fast enough. And so here they are. This grass is probably 5 inches tall, and they're cutting it down probably to 2 inches. And so they violated the 1/3 rule. They sure did. Yeah. But they're in a difficult situation here. They were probably told, and whoever did it was told to cut that low, I would assume. And so it was not a proper thing to do. It was such a vigorous, fast growing grass that it was able to tolerate this, even though it was stressed during a few weeks in that spring period. So like they were able to catch up eventually and the grass returned to good health. And this is an old photograph that a lot of land grant universities around the country did this kind of study with mowing height, showing you dandelion growth, where on the far right there you have, what's it, 1.5 inch cutting height. You see all the dandelions that are present versus they can barely see it, it's kind of cut off, but on the far left, you have a 2.5 inch cutting height. Even the 2 inch, you have far fewer dandelions growing. And so 2 inches usually for most of our cool season grasses, you don't need to grow much beyond that. 2 inches is, 2.5 inches is often a good goal to have with a lot of our grasses. So too many homeowners, when they cut their grass, like my nephew, I guess, they think that, they want to have that golf course look, maybe, a nice short cut, but it's not creating a healthy turf for them at all when they cut that low all the time. And another thing that is commonly misdone is not sharpening the blade often enough. I mean, really, absolute minimum would be once a year, and probably even more than that to give you a better cut. But what happens when you have a dull blade? So if it's a rotary mower, which most everyone has in the homes, it's dull, and so it doesn't really cut the blade, it shreds it as it goes around high speed, and it really opens up a wound at the tips of the blades, and it desiccates the turf pretty well. In fact, you'll often, and I was guilty of this too, when I was a young guy, I also was in charge of cutting my grass, only because my dad didn't want to. But we didn't sharpen the blade often enough. And before the end of the season, I think we often did do it once a year, but by the end of the season, it started getting kind of dull. And I would cut the grass, and then I'd look out and it had like a white, like a frosty appearance to it. And that's because, after a few days after you cut it, it desiccates because it's been shredded, and it opens it up, and it, that water at the moisture at the tips of the grass it just dries up and turns white in color. And it also opens it up potentially for fungal invasions as well. So that's why you want to keep your blade nice and sharp, as shown there. What a difference. You can see that tip, kind of a frosted looking appearance to it, versus when you have a nice clean cut, you maintain that darker color. All right. So there's the types of mowers we have available that are commonly used. The rotary blade mower, which everyone uses, and what they're typically, probably too often, they use the clipper bag, or they collect their clippings. It's really been shown that the benefits of recycling your clippings, as long as I hear different measurements. I hear 1 inch is where you want to maximize the size of your clippings. I've heard others say, well, you can go up to about maybe 1.5 inches, and it won't look too unsightly if you recycle. You leave your clippings on the ground. I don't know, maybe 1.5 inches might be pushing it a bit, but certainly 1 inch or 1.25 inches, I would think would be okay. It would look all right. And when you leave the blades on the grass, it does. A common misconception is it promotes thatch. It does not. Leaf blades from grass is 90%, 85% water, and it doesn't contain, unlike stems that contain lignins, which are decomposing slowly. The grass blades decompose really rapidly. It doesn't contain any of the ligands like the stems contain. And so that's why one of the biggest problems with some of these stolons or the rhizomes is that they contain ligands in the stems, and they build up and they produce thatch. Again, we were talking during break with the zoysia grass. One of their biggest problems is that there can be a terrible thatch producer. Things like chinch bugs love high thatch. I'll talk a little bit more about thatch. Those few of you who may not be familiar with it, although I think maybe most of you are. Thatch is pretty well understood. But just remember that as long as you don't make the cutting blade too long and it looks clumpy or unattractive, you can leave your clippings there, and it promotes maybe close to an extra pound of nitrogen per year on the turf. And there's a study that was done. I show you. I have a series of photographs. I'll just flip through them real quick. But studies that have shown the appearance of blades where the blades were recycled, and it looks a lot better, at least somewhat better, than where they were collected. So I'll show you that in just a minute. All right, well, this is the rotary type, the conventional type rotary that we're familiar with. If some of you maybe have what's it called? My mind is blank. Where it cuts the blade twice. Mulching mower. Thank you, mulching mower. Difficult word to remember. And what that really is you have two blades, and they kind of rotate around in opposite directions, I believe. And it cuts the blades twice, and maybe so you can leave a longer. You can cut it a longer height, and it still looks attractive. It cuts it twice. Okay, and then this is actually a superior mower as far as cutting. This is what the golf course people use, and with it called a reel mower. It's on a rotating cylinder, very sharp. Good maintenance with this, keep the blades exceptionally sharp. I worked briefly with a golf course superintendent when I was very young, and some of these blades, they would sharpen at least minimum once a week, and sometimes more often than that. They've always cut these really sharp, and you can cut extremely low. The bent grass, when you're going to be cutting to a 1/4 inch or less, you're going to have to be using a reel mower with this rotating drums that they're on. Okay, much cleaner, sharper cut. Okay. So here's the question: to bag or not to bag? I think the problem with this is that we don't want to fill up our landfills with all these clippings. I know some townships will collect the clippings and they'll combine it with what they collected in the fall with leaves, and then they'll give it out as mulch, oftentimes free of charge. There's some townships that do that. The only problem is when they run out of leaves, and then because you don't really want to mulch grass clippings by themselves, they create a problem when you do that. So yeah, it's really a problem with landfills. We don't want to unnecessarily fill up landfills with grass clippings, and so yeah, we try to recycle them. Yeah, shown there on the left where the grass was too long, it looks unsightly. It's like clumping. But when it was done properly, there on the right-hand side, it looks fine. The grass blades will filter down into the turf pretty readily. And as I said, they really do decompose rapidly. And gosh, they're 85% or more water. And so it actually gives the grass a little bit of a drink of water too, as it breaks down. And so, but this is a problem. This is what some of the commercial guys, even though they know that it'd be better to leave their clippings and recycle them, there are some that they just demand that you collect. They don't want those clippings. So they demand that you collect them. And so I'm sure there's some of you have provided mowing services where you have this problem with a client and they just demand it. And there's no questions.
They'll pay extra.
Yeah, they'll pay extra for you to collect them. Yeah, so you can't beat that. All right. Okay, enough of that. This is the Rutgers research that was done in the early 90s. I just want to show you some photographs, just showing you the amount of nitrogen that could be done with this extra yields of grass clippings. This is 0 pounds, 2 pounds, and 4 pounds, plus those where the clippings were returned. Now, this is only clipping yields. Oh, this is showing you when you fertilize this amount, 4 pounds of nitrogen per year is a lot. I think now the maximum for commercial, what is it, 3.9? What's as far as nitrogen fertilization? Maybe it's nice for homeowners, is 3.9 maximum amount of nitrogen you are allowed to put down. I should have reviewed this. I know commercial, you have to have a fertilizer license now, and they spell this all out for you. It's almost impossible to regulate. But just showing you the amount of clippings based on the rate of fertilization. Okay, and that's more than doubles if you had no fertilizer on the yellow versus the red with 4 pounds. So when you really fertilize heavily, you produce a lot of clippings. Which makes sense. Okay. All right. So what they're kind of showing you here that what's the difference when you return your clippings versus you remove them. So I don't know how good this photograph or what it looks like. It looks all washed out. It doesn't really show much. You can't even tell much of a difference. But on the computer, you can tell a difference, but not here. This is showing you maybe a little bit more of a green coloration. Both cases up both rows here, vertical rows. 2 pounds of nitrogen was applied, nitrogen was applied to both of those sites. And, you know, actually a little bit better on that side. That was a little better.
That side looks a little greater.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that's a better photo there. And then on the right, where the clippings were removed, it has a little bit more of a pale coloration to it. Okay, so just showing you, it wasn't a tremendous difference. Now this is a 2-year study. Or actually, was it a 3-year study? I will find out. I forget. I think it was a 2-year study. Showing you the color rating, and what people would do, they would go and they would visually look at the different plots where the clippings, how much nitrogen was put down, you know, applied, and also whether clippings were removed or they were returned. And they would rate the color, and this is just kind of a subjective visualization that they made. And these are the ratings that were done month by month. Okay, and so where the clippings were returned, you got the green, looks a little bit better, a little better color rating. Okay, now that was the first year. There was a 3-year study. Very good. Figured that out. Now this is a little bit better, even more so on that screen, where again that top section, these 2 top sections, both of these plots are 3 foot by 5 foot. So there's 4 of them here. So you can see where the clippings were returned, whether it was 2 pounds of nitrogen or 4 pounds, it didn't make any difference really. The ones above looked better than the 2 that were below as far as the color rating. So this was all this study was, just a visualization of what would turf would look like if you return the clippings versus remove them. And so, yeah, so it's a bit of a difference, no question. And so that's a 3-year study. And so this is after 3 years, so this apparently is the 3rd year, if that's correct, where actually after 3 years, the color rating even became more of a difference. So that you get a benefit over an extended period of time by returning the clippings. Maybe that first year, it was rather somewhat of a difference, but it became even more significant improvement by the 3rd year. So that's what this study basically was showing. So I don't know if any of you have had that experience with your operations or some of your clients where maybe you've done some that clippings are returned and some where they were removed, and you can maybe see a bit of a difference. So, all right. Okay, I think I don't want to get too much involved with these graphs, but anyway, there were definitely a better color result with the returning the clippings. That was the summary of the study. Okay, and also weed population, by the way, as well, only because by returning the clippings, you're giving a bit of an extra amount of nitrogen, and nitrogen will help the turf grass to compete better against the weeds. That's another benefit of just putting nitrogen down, not only to improve the color and the growth of the weeds, but to be more competitive and basically outcompete the weeds to some extent. I'm showing you here, the weeds controlled were much better or significantly better than when the clippings were returned in green. There's less weeds. Weed counts per 1,000 square feet were definitely less than in the red where the clippings were removed. All right, that's enough of that. Let's move on. Okay. That was a study that was three years long, and they had pretty good results with it. And that was back 30 years ago. And they remember when I was first starting with Rutgers, even before I started with Rutgers, I remember seeing that study, and it was rather dramatic difference between the two. Hopefully, they realized, maybe some people who were doubtful about the value of returning the clippings, if you were permitted to do so, but if you're a commercial operator and the clients will permit you to do so, then you get benefits from that. Okay. All right. So as far as fertility, okay, and this is something, I kind of wonder what happened here. I mean, you often see these photographs when you get people, extension people give this type of a talk. I don't know. Whenever I see this, I always think of the same thing. It was in the fall. It was probably October. good time to fertilize, right? And it was kind of in the afternoon. It was the dad was watching the football game on Sunday afternoon, and his wife says, you know, you said you were going to fertilize the turf today. And of course, it starts this time of year when it gets into October, the daylight starts to get less and less pretty quickly. So he realized, boy, I better get out there at halftime and do as fast as I can do. So get back for the second half. So he had about 15, 20 minutes before the second half began. Whether that, I'm sure that wasn't true, but that's what I'm thinking when I see something like this that was so obviously misapplied where the irrigation, rather the fertilizer was applied. This just shows you when they early on, this was taken in pretty early in the spring, you had the area where the turf had been fertilized turns green earlier than the area where it wasn't fertilized. In time, as the weeks went by, they kind of became more uniform in appearance. But initially, that fertilized area really greened up fast in the earlier part of the spring. And then he shows you the areas that he missed. Missed a lot of areas. Okay. And there's different ways to apply fertilizers. Drop spreaders on the left versus rotary spreaders on the right. Commercial obviously would be using rotary. Much wider spread, get a lot more done faster. This just shows you why the fall is a good time to fertilize. And because of the growth rate, the shoots and the carbohydrate storage and so forth are all peaking and increasing in the fall. And so this is a good time to fertilize. And then things in the spring is really concentrated on shoot growth. So it's already going to grow a lot in the spring. And so you don't want to maybe put down too much extra nitrogen where you're already going to have a lot of shoot growth taking place. And the root growth is starting to drop. And so you don't want to lose too much root growth. So if you really pile on the nitrogen too much in the spring, you're going to even have more shoot growth than really would be desirable. So this is why the fall period is really the better time to do your fertilizations. In fact, it's being stated that, I've heard different percentages. I've heard 2/3 or even 3/4 of most of your fertilizers should be applied in the fall. And some species of grasses, in fact, if you had tall fescue or a fine fescue, maybe just a fall fertilization would do it. Maybe you do two fertilizations in the fall, one around Labor Day and maybe another one toward the end of October. And don't do any fertilization at all in the spring at all. So that's just a thought. And that's just, I think, the fault of the advertisers. They really push, it's spring, it's time to get out there and do stuff on your lawn, buy fertilizer. That's not really the wait till the fall is better thing. Advertisers don't like that. So these are the three primary macronutrients that we use for fertilization. It's always in this order: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And the ideal rate for years has always been stated to be about 4:1:2, 4 times as much nitrogen as phosphorus, and then twice as much nitrogen as potassium. But it's really been shown with a lot of our tests in many of our soils that we have enough phosphorus already in many situations, and we don't always need to be putting down even the smaller amount of phosphorus down every time we fertilize. And so that's been a change with our fertilizer laws as well. It's been stated to avoid what's called eutrophication, which is excessive growth in our ponds and lakes and rivers and so forth, even bays. We want to try to avoid the runoff, which creates this excessive growth in our water. Yeah, algae bloom eutrophication is the term. And what happens is that you're promoting a lot of growth, so much so that the oxygen levels and then you have dieback occurring. And then when you have decaying, it uses up oxygen. And so the level of saturated oxygen in the water begins to get lower and lower. And you start having a degraded aquatic environment. You know, some of the, you know, other plants can't survive, or animals, or fish, shellfish and so forth can't survive. Yeah, yeah.
What's it called?
Yeah, I got a picture of it right here. Ah, I think I'll get back to that. Where is it? Right here. Yeah. This is embarrassing where this picture was taken. Have anyone ever been to the Adelphia Rutgers turf research plots? Right near Freehold? That's it. That's it. That's a pond there. It's a creek that flows through here, and this is kind of an area where it widens out and it gets thin again. But you see all the extra growth taking place. This is all surrounding. There's some parked cars here, but in most of these areas where they've done a lot of their turf plot testing with lots of fertilizers and so forth, you get runoff, and you got eutrophication there. They're aware of this. It's not that they don't know what's going on, but it's just kind of funny that this shows you when you get excessive amounts of nutrients flowing into these waterways, which is what they do at these turf plots. They put down a lot of experimental, you know, levels of fertilizers, and you get excessive runoff.
So if you notify fertilizer now, they'll adjust for the lower levels of nitrogen and phosphorus?
No, you have to make that decision based on soil tests.
Based on what?
Soil tests,
Oh.
which are done for home lawns, usually recommend about every 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. Okay.
And
How many people walk in Home Depot?
yeah, no, they don't.
The guys with a commercial.
I know, isn't it terrible? Yeah,
You go to Home Depot, there are people who walk out with one bag.
yeah. I remember when this fertilizer law, and Rutgers was kind of in a bad situation here. We were asked by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection to kind of lead the movement in education. And so we were kind of the fall guy. And I remember back, I guess it was like 2014, we had one of our extension people give a talk on the fertilizer laws. And when it first came out, I felt so sorry for this woman. She was a sweet woman. I know her. You know, she's an extension person, but the crowd was hostile toward her because it was all commercial. And just like what you're expressing, you're right, is what you just said. The primary offenders of this are the homeowners. Yeah, not the commercial guys. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's
It's
just,
easy to regulate us. because
it is.
we are.
You cannot regulate the homeowners. No, that's pretty much impossible. Yeah. And of course, their attitude is, hey, it's my lawn, I do what I want.
So if I were to go in and get fertilizer, I would have to basically first get a test done. And then.
Yeah, it's always recommended. If you don't know, especially it's been a number of years, you kind of get an idea of what is present in your soils as far as nutrients and what's lacking, what your pH levels are. That's a critical thing to
So
know.
then you just get separate bags of each and then mix them together? Is that what you're supposed to do? Because this is like I went to buy fertilizer.
Yeah, it
once,
can get kind of
and
complicated.
it was basically the standard, and I just
Well,
walked out because I didn't.
I know. Oh, let's go back to that
Okay,
again.
I'm sorry. you
yeah,
have
that's
a-
fine.
you have a-
What you do now is that to be able to buy a fertilizer that contains phosphorus, you have to show there's a need for it in your soil.
Okay, so I can't even buy it as a homeowner.
Um,
Can't buy a bag of fertilizer with phosphorus.
you know, I'm not sure about that. I don't
It's
think,
okay, I don't want to too much.
yeah,
That's
Yeah.
fine, I could find that. Thank you.
yeah. For commercial, though, they have to show a need for it.
Okay.
For homeowners, maybe not. But the thing is, where you're going to be buying your fertilizer from, they may not have anything available with phosphorus in it.
It may not.
They may
Okay.
not. And I think that's more likely going to be the case.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah. So you'd have to go to place that's frequented by commercial. And then you're gonna have to have a license to buy. So this is the NPK is what's always in that order. And these are the soil nutrients. And there's 17 of them. I think I have maybe 14 listed there. I know I'm missing a couple. Oxygen is one I'm missing. I think I'm missing hydrogen. And the other one, was it silicon? Maybe I'm missing. Those are the 17 required nutrients. And some are thought of as being macronutrients, which is on the left. And the micronutrients are needed in just minute quantities, but are still required at least in some amounts for the turf to be able, for the plant to be able to grow, for the plants to grow properly. One thing will happen if you're putting a new turf grass down, and it just so happens that you don't do a soil test, for example, and you just put it down with maybe just nitrogen as a fertilizer. You may have a thinking that you have enough phosphorus. And if you don't, then you're going to show maybe some initial good growth, but then your turf is going to turn purple. And it's going to start to die back. And it may be, well, because it didn't have enough phosphorus in it. And when you have a new turf grass growing, their roots are not very extensive. And if you don't have much in the way of phosphorus in the soil, that's why when you first put down a new established turf, there is what's called a starter fert. And that does have more phosphorus in it because the roots are so not very extensive and limited that you need that additional phosphorus for the roots to be able to find and grab on to the phosphorus that is there. So I think I actually have a diagram of that, but all right. But definitely nitrogen is needed in the greatest quantity. It's also the nutrient that leaches the fastest. If you do a soil test and you get the results back, say like you send it out to Rutgers or whatever, you can do it yourself. There's some soil tests you can do yourself. Oftentimes you won't get nitrogen results because of the fact that it can change so readily. Maybe on a fertilizer and maybe it rains for a couple of weeks, a few times. Much of that nitrogen may have already leached out, especially if it's a more sandy type soil. So, but that is needed in the greatest quantity, and it does promote, produces the chlorophyll. It gives that nice green color and the leaf growth and density. However, if you put down too much nitrogen, then it starts to produce in the way of more pests, and even not only, animal pests like insects, but also diseases. There are some of the more, devastating turf diseases will thrive in a high nitrogen type turf that has a lot of soil with containing nitrogen. Some of the worst diseases like brown patch and pythium and summer patch, maybe a little bit less summer patch, but if you have high levels of nitrogen, those diseases will be greater. You'll be driving those diseases. And people make the mistake, especially for something like pythium, which is not all that common in home lawns, but when it occurs, you know you've got it because it kills turf rapidly. Within 24 hours, you could have a dead turf area. But if you are beginning to have some pythium present, you say, well, I need to put some fertilizer down. You're gonna make it worse, and you will make it worse. Right. So as far as phosphorus, this is one that has kind of really been targeted by the DEP to help prevent eutrophication from taking place. This is showing you deficient phosphorus where it slows down the growth after an initial decent start, and then it slows down to a crawl and begins to show a purple coloration. That may well be because of low pH or just simply low phosphorus. Oftentimes it's the pH that's the culprit, the reason. All right. So there's a starter fertilizer showing there at the top, oftentimes 1:2 to 1. So you have a higher level of phosphorus only because of the fact that the roots are not very extensive and you need more phosphorus for them to find it as they grow in the soil. It's just a good quick diagram showing you where young plants are on the right. Maybe you need that extra phosphorus for it to be able to grow properly because it's harder for the, there's not enough phosphorus in the soil, it won't be able to find it. And this is the runoff problem we were talking about with eutrophication. Okay, and yeah, it's certainly a problem. I was going to say something about this slide. I didn't actually take it, but I remember someone who made a comment about. It was actually the slide that my former supervisor took in his neighborhood, and he told me something that was really interesting, but now I can't remember. So sorry. Sorry. And that's the eutrophication. Yeah. All right, and this potassium. This is one that no, potassium is really best for building up tolerances to stresses. So if you've got certain, as indicates here, drought stress, even kind of that's probably the biggest benefit of, one of the biggest benefits of potassium. And it works with the stomates. Stomates is where the gas exchange takes place. You're probably familiar with stomates, and this will help actually close off the stomates for a while. I can't do it indefinitely, and to get through that drought period a little bit better. Because grasses, some of them can tolerate drought for a few weeks, but something like perennial ryegrass, that's not going to tolerate more than just a few quick, short weeks before it starts to die back. Yeah. That photograph I showed you, comparing the hard fescue, which is fairly drought tolerant, versus the perennial ryegrass, which was basically dead. I mean, it shows the difference in what drought can do, and maybe within 3 or 4 weeks, perennial ryegrass will start to die back considerably with no water. Okay. So various disease resistance with potassium and wear tolerance. And so it just, whatever type of stress that's there, that's what potassium, its greatest benefit for the plant will be, to be able to at least temporarily tolerate these conditions until they improve again. Okay, I'm going to move along here, just showing you some of the moderate rates of fertilizations. This is for homeowners. I think the maximum amount, this is good for homeowners to know this, the maximum amount you can apply at any one time is, it's still a lot, I think, maybe more than it should be. 9/10 of a pound per 1,000 square feet, that's nitrogen. And so I don't know what the max is for commercial. It's a little bit higher than that. Maybe was it one? Can anyone tell me what commercial? I'm asking questions now again. I asked a question before and someone came up and told me some good information. What's the maximum amount for commercial? This is something I wanted to review in my mind, but I didn't think of a chance to do that. I think it's at least 1.1 pound per application. Anyone tell me that? Yeah.
What's the stuff we're using in spring, we're doing like 4.3 pounds.
Well, that's for the season.
Well, no, I'm saying
Yeah,
like
yeah.
it's 4.3 per 1,000 just for the product around one. Usually it's about 20%. So
Oh, okay, gotcha.
you know what I mean? So you're just over 0.8. You're around
Yeah.
0.9.
Yeah. So I don't think you really want to generally want to go much beyond 1 pound per 1,000.
That nitrogen?
This is nitrogen, yes.
Okay, 0.9 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000.
Oh, okay, yeah,
And no more than 3.2 pounds of nitrogen for a year.
right. And that would be homeowners. Yes, for homeowners. Yeah. So this is giving you an example of 3 fertilizations per year. Again, kind of emphasizing 2 of them in the fall. So I wouldn't really want to probably need to go much beyond this. This will give you almost, if you go with the highest rate of 0.9, that's 2.7 for the year. And if you recycle your clippings, that's another pound. So you're already approaching 4 pounds of nitrogen. I don't think your lawn really needs more than that of nitrogen, unless it's just pure sand where everything leaches out really quick. Yeah, that's the thing, is it depends upon a lot with these nutrients is what type of texture of soil it has. It's sand, clay, loam. That determines the leaching by significant levels. So yeah. Some of the worst places I've seen, I've told you before about dollar spot and red thread, is on the slopes of a sandy soil, because the nitrogen just leaches away pretty quickly. and both of those diseases, like turf that's under stress, it has very low nitrogen level, it's going to be under stress. And so that's when you get the dollar spot and the red thread. So that's where oftentimes they don't want to put down too much, because you're going to maybe overstimulate it and then get the more serious diseases, which will be stimulated by nitrogen. But you can put down maybe a quarter pound or so additional nitrogen to help green it up and maybe help eliminate some of that dollar spot and red thread, or at least make the symptoms less. Okay. You know, I didn't really get an answer from the commercial guys. I don't think anyone said anything. I kind of wonder now, is still dollar spot or red thread the #1 turf disease we find out there? No doubt, no doubt about it. Okay. Yeah.
Red thread you see, but it's not. It's usually that's almost between 1 and 2, where it's just
Yeah.
if the heavy rains, you almost
Right.
or something like that.
Yeah, I know the red thread is less tolerant of the warmer temperatures, with dollar spot can tolerate the warmer temperatures for a while as you move into the summer. So, yeah. Okay. So just showing you kind of a chart, and this is kind of max. This is maxing out the amount of nitrogen fertilizers that a homeowner could use. And Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, and these are suggestions with those species. There's nothing says that you can't put down 3.2 pounds of nitrogen for fine fescues, but I don't think it would be required, and you'd probably maybe be detrimental to that species to put down that much nitrogen. It probably would. And so don't always think that nitrogen is the best thing to do. It depends upon the species and as well as the soil type. There's a lot of variables. So give this kind of a talk, and you can't give just general basic rule of thumb for everything. There's just too many conditions that have to be looked into. Okay. So, but boy, I tell you, I don't know, 4 fertilizations a year? Oh, geez, that's a lot. I don't know how many homeowners do that. I have a homeowner that where I live, a few doors down. Yes, every time I seem like I look out it seems like once a month he's out there fertilizing, and he does it in the summer too. Yeah, just a little bit too much. He thinks, as was suggested, a little bit helps. A lot more is even better.
Well, Scott's offered a 4-step program.
Oh.
When I'm sitting here,
Yeah.
he's telling you I have a 4-step program.
Haven't they kind of backed away from that, Scott's 4-step? I know that they really did promote that a few decades ago. I know they've kind of stepped back from it, because environmentally speaking, that was one of the most kind of irresponsible program. Some of the fertilizations they were putting down, it just wasn't really necessary.
What I see now is a 3-step.
Is it 3-step?
The weed treatment for
Yeah.
summer and then fall.
And they try to keep things simple, you know, and they try to do what they can to make it a cookbook approach. And when you do that, there's going to be situations where it really wasn't the best.
Well, how many people actually read what they-
Yeah, very true. Yeah, we all.
Would you be interested to see what that label says?
Yeah, there's some great information on some of these labels.
Yeah.
It really is. Yeah. But it also is a great, you know, if you get insomnia, start reading the label. That'll help. Okay, I was gonna go through some calculations, but I'm not gonna do that. But there's some simple calculations that everyone should do. And if you're gonna be applying your own fertilizer, I'm kind of speaking to the homeowners now, you really have to learn what these quick, easy, simple formulas are. It's just, I don't know, 4th grade math, maybe. There's percentages, and because I'll tell you what, I'll do one. Let's see, where is it? Yeah, water insoluble nitrogen. It's been shown that we'd prefer to have about 40% of the nitrogen we put down to be what's classified as water insoluble, which means it's not going to just swoosh, like a quickly leach away after a rain event. And so if it's has some water insoluble properties to it, it'll hang around longer. And this is one that's going to be on the bag, but it's confusing if you don't kind of follow what these percentages are saying. So this is saying that what percentage of slow release nitrogen is in a 25-10 fertilizer bag having a WIN, or water insoluble nitrogen, of 8%. I think the key thing is to remember is that that 8% is it's going to be compared to that 20%. So I can tell you right now, those two numbers, it's 40%. So if I can I'm kind of skipping ahead here. So the bag contains 20% nitrogen. Now that 8% actually represents the entire 50-pound bag by weight. But we're comparing it what's actually in the nitrogen. So the 20% is 100% within the bag. So what does that represent as far as slow release? So if it was 10% compared to 20%, that means it was 50% slow release. In this case, it's 8%. So you do that simple cross multiplication, and then, 8 times 100 divided by 20, that'll give you 40. So that's 40% slow release or water insoluble nitrogen. So that's just a quick thing that people are confused by that, those percentages and what it means. And just to remember, it's comparing the total amount, 20% is actually 100% nitrogen. Yeah, so don't make that mistake. All right. So now we got with pH, all right? Now pH stands for potential nitrogen, is the name for that. That's why you have that acronym. The P is always the smaller letter case. And it's very important to determine pH to know what's the element availability on different pH levels that a plant can be able to take up. So as you see that between those two red lines, 6 and 6.5, or at least for turf grass at least, that's often considered to be the ideal pH range. So you look at all those different elements, and majority of them kind of max out of what's available for them. It does start to get a little bit thin on the calcium as you go to the lower pH, but you can see how they change based on pH level with each different element. So that's why the pH is so important. It's element availability. And pH is based on a logarithmic scale, which can be quite confusing to people as well. And what that means, if you're less familiar with it, is that it's a base 10. And so if you go from, say, for example, 7, which is considered to be neutral, and then you drop it down to 6, that means that soil between the 0, or rather the 7 and the 6, contains 10 times more hydrogen ions in it, which gives it its acidity. Okay, so if you go from 7 to 5, that's 100 times more acidic. And it goes the same thing with the different other direction, which is the alkalinity, or if it's basic or not. So this is some of the pH levels of common things we're familiar with, and mostly are acid I have there. Sulfuric acid is 1. Battery acid is 2. Coca-Cola, I had Coca-Cola. I don't try not to drink too much. Had some yesterday. That's a pH of 3. Definitely acidic. The coffee is, I just had some coffee. That's 4. And then lye is 13, so it's very basic. And cow's milk is 6.4, also slightly acidic. Ammonia would be also basic or alkaline, right? Ammonia's, yeah. And so this gives you an idea. Now you've heard of acid rain? Yeah. Well, typically rain many times is between 5.7 and 6, which can vary upon where you're located. If you're near a lot of factories and so forth, spewing out a lot of pollutants, you may have a little bit higher pH with your rain, or lower pH, or more acidic. So that's what that all means. And so why is this important? Why is lime important? Well, sometimes basic, it's not basic, I don't want to confuse my terms here. Essentially, as you go east of the 100th meridian, roughly around the Mississippi River, Mississippi a little bit east of it, but usually many of our soils east of let's say Mississippi, is going to be a bit on the acid side. The reason is we get a lot of rain that washes away things like calcium or magnesium. It washes away, and so the soil particles become a bit more acidic because that allows the hydrogen ion to attach to the soil particles. Soil particles have a negative, a negative ion to it, whereas the things like magnesium and calcium are positive. So the opposite attract and they stick together. Hydrogen is also attracted to the soil particles, and so when you remove by rain, and you remove the calcium and the magnesium, you get more hydrogen attaching, and it becomes more acidic over time. So if you go west, and out west in the Mississippi, you have less rainfall for the most part, and the soils are more alkaline in general. Now you have differences. You have some limestone outcroppings occur, as it create a very high pH soil in that area. So you have local differences, of course, but that's why you have, you apply lime, and like calcitic lime is also a magnesium dolomitic lime. You apply that to the soil, which will then contains a little higher positivity to it, double ion, and it cleaves the hydrogen off and it attaches to the soil particle. And so that stays for a while until the rain comes and washes that off and has to be reapplied again over time. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to get that pH to a higher level because that's the trend, to get maybe too low over time and keep it at least in the upper 5s with turf grass. And of course, there's some plants that like it quite low, very low pH. Some of the ericaceous plants, azalea, rhododendrons, they like very low pH. Where turf grass likes it, I think it's usually a good middle range would be 6 to 6.5 for the most part. Although you can go a little bit lower or a little above, still probably okay. All right, so that's potential hydrogen pH. Okay. I confuse everybody enough on that? I'm speaking mostly to the. I want to keep calling you master gardeners, but you're not master gardeners, are you? Yeah. What are the name for? I know it used to be master gardeners. Certified gardeners. Gloucester County certified gardeners. Yeah. Okay. Remember that. Okay. And showing you how turf grass is affected by pH, and as it gets too low, as shown there on the two right areas, the roots become less vigorous, a lot more shallow. Okay. All right. So I say 6.2 and 6.5. I've heard different ranges. 6, I think, is fine for the most part. Okay. All right. There's two different major types of lime. You've got the dolomitic lime, which contains more of the magnesium, whereas the calcitic lime, which is the more commonly one used, which contains more calcium in it. Okay. And why is fall the best time to apply lime? Any ideas there? Well, you can apply lime anytime as you can. It can still be a benefit, of course. But the thing is, it takes time for this lime to be able to kind of filter down through the soil. It can actually take a couple of years really for it to have a major impact on the soil. And so the idea with the fall application is to maybe try to encourage a little bit of a faster rate of it as you get the freeze-thaw interaction occurring in the winter time. The ground freezes and it thaws. It kind of opens up and closes the ground. That allows the lime to move a little deeper faster. So that's why, even though you can apply lime anytime, really, even in the middle of summer if you want, just don't burn the grass. And all right. Okay, I'm gonna skip that. All right, watering turf. What do you think happened here? Yeah, this is a turf that's under drought. And when the turf gets really dry, its turgor pressure begins to get pretty much reduced. And what turgidity allows is the turf grass that has enough moisture to kind of spring back up again. So as you had these, whatever went through there, I guess maybe a mower or some kind, or any kind of a piece of equipment walking, or rather rolling through there, it left these lines because as it bent the grass down, the grass didn't have enough turgor pressure to spring back up again. So you walk over a very dry turf, you can see your footprints. Yeah, because it just doesn't spring back up anymore without with such low levels of water within the blades. So that's as far as watering turf. Water in the morning is certainly the best. And there's several reasons for that. One of the bigger reasons is that you don't want to water late in the day when oftentimes I see my neighbors do that, is because the sun's going down. It's gonna not dry in time. It's gonna be nightfall and the turf's gonna be wet maybe all night long, even though in some cases dew would come on the turf anyway later in the evening. But you're just extending that wetness period if you water late in the day. And why don't you want to do that? Is mostly because of potential diseases. A good number of our leaf lesion type diseases is fungi that causes damage, or rather they infect the foliage of the leaves and they leave lesions. They need a certain minimum amount of free moisture on the turf before they can successfully infect. Many times it's 12 hours, 14 hours of that extended relief wetness. And if you keep it less than that, there'll be less of a potential for infections to take place. But a good number of our common leaf type turf diseases. Okay. All right, so here it says, do the watering before 9 a.m. in the morning. Morning's a good time because you have the day. If it's a sunny day, it's going to dry and plenty of time before it becomes nightfall again. Probably dries within an hour or two. And so this is what it depends upon how much you water based on the soil type, sandy versus clay and its percentages. They say that for a more higher clay or a loamy type soil, then maybe just a 1 inch of rain or even irrigation combination just happens to equal 1 inch is all that's needed, per week. It's a little more sandy, maybe 1.5 inches. Some say, well, maybe it's really sandy. I might want to go 2 inches. Okay, you may have to water a little bit more often for sure, maybe double the amount. But this best watering time is, they say here at least, 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. Good time to water. The worst time would be probably about 5 to 7 when people are getting home from work. And second worst time would be 10 a.m. to 12 noon. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, maybe you did have dew on the turf in the evening, but then the sun rose and it starts to dry things off, but then you water it again. And so you extend that leaf wetness and maybe you start getting to that 12 to 14 hour range period to allow some of these diseases to infect the turf. So anyway, so these are some of the rule of thumbs for best watering times. And how much do you water? Well, they're just showing you here, free moisture on leaf surface is required. And I don't have this information directly in front of me, but there's certain diseases that do require that a minimum level of free moisture. And many of them are around that 12 to 14 hour period. And so that's important to know. Right. And just another way of looking at it. The black are the bad times and the white are the good times. Yeah. Okay. So this is what happens. Kind of looks like similar with the mowing, doesn't it? Yeah. Now, deep and frequent watering will encourage the deeper roots. And if you water too frequently and very shallow, well, the roots are not going to go down deeper. There's no water down there because everything's just, there's just a brief watering, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you know, wet the top surface of the soil. So the roots are going to stay there. And that's where they're going to be becoming more extensive. And when you do have a more serious drought and maybe you can't water, maybe you have watering restrictions, then you start getting dead turf because you've got shallow root systems. The turf's going to be very vulnerable to a drought. Because that's the great thing about tall fescue. If you allow it to go deep with its root systems, which it wants to do, then it can tolerate a drought for a fair amount of time, a good amount of time. Yeah, some say, what about if you have clay soil and it doesn't take much water and it starts to run off? Well, you can't water as long at a single period. Maybe you have to water a bit more often, but just shallow. And so clay is it's a difficult thing to work with. And, that's why the ideal turf is going to be like a loam. It's more. So sandy soils, though, of course, as I've indicated, will leach out too quickly. So you get quite a differences between what's required and what type of soil you have. So it's important to know. Okay, 1 inch of water per week is what that's the rule of thumb. But again, it's variable depending upon what soil type you have, and also if it's shade or sun. I mean, if you've got a shaded area in your lawn, and you have fine fescue growing in that shade, maybe it's going to be okay because of the tolerate the shade, but it doesn't want a lot of water. If you start watering that, you're going to probably start thinning it out even quite a bit, and maybe encourage diseases as well. So there's a lot of negative things you can do by overwatering, especially in the shade. Okay. All right. Move along here. So as far as irrigation, what requires the most and the least, based on the species. I've kind of already talked a lot about this already. Perennial ryegrass requires the most water, requires the most fertilizer, requires the most mowing. So what's one of the most intensive turf grasses you can have is perennial ryegrass. It's not as high as bentgrass, but it's getting up there. And then the least would be the fine fescue. And that tall fescue is kind of a good happy medium there. I remember when I first started working with Rutgers, my boss came from the lower southern sections of Virginia. Grew up there. I was really a big fan of tall fescue. Started, the time when Rutgers was still really promoting the Kentucky bluegrass. And there was actually a bit of a conflict between Agent and Ocean County, as was where I was at, and then at least one or two of the professors at Rutgers. And so kind of learned not to say anything because they were doing all their research with Kentucky bluegrass. Had an idea growing up in Virginia and has now moved up here, especially with the climate change. Tall fescue can survive our winters quite nicely now, whereas maybe 50 years ago it had a little more struggle doing so at times. Now it really grows well here. So as far as another real problem with some of our grasses, some more than others, is the idea of thatch. Now thatch is something that is up to about a ½ inch or so is actually good. It provides some protection and irrigation and some wearability for the roots, protects them to a degree. But when it starts getting up to around 3/4 of an inch to an inch or more, then thatch is a detriment. It encourages, thatch is produced by especially roots and stolons, if it's a warm season grass, or rhizomes if it's a cool season grass. And excuse me. And so if it if you're really growing vigorously, produce, crowns is up part of the grass too, but one point is also a very slow decomposing. So you start getting a lot of this accumulation in the thatch, it's not decomposing, and it builds up to high levels. And things like chinch bugs, I said, and sod webworm, they really like living in the thatch because it gives them protection. And they really thrive in those areas. And it creates a problem for the roots then too, because eventually this high thatch produces kind of a hydrophobic layer, and the rainwater can't penetrate it as well. And maybe it starts to spread out in the thatch, and maybe where the water is going to be mostly located in that thatch area, and then where are the roots going to start growing? Within the thatch. And we want the roots, of course, in the soil deeper. And so thatch can do a lot of negative things when it starts getting to be too much. Okay. And this has, the sheaths, the crowns, the rhizomes, the stolons, and the roots as well, all can promote, thatch production. Not, as I indicated in stress, not the leaf blades, because they don't have any lignin in them, and they can be decomposed really fast, and it's mostly water anyway. So maybe 85, 90% water within the leaf blades. So not to worry about thatch and leaf blades or clippings being returned. It's not going to create thatch. Now, as listed here, all of these turf grass produce thatch to some level. Kentucky bluegrass, creeping red fescue to a level can produce thatch. Now, as I indicated, the creeping red fescue also has the underground rhizomes. They just not quite as extensive as the Kentucky bluegrass. And so even though they can still get thatch though, build up with the creeping red fescue. And then of course we've talked about zoysia grass, and then bent grass also has a lot of these. This is another question maybe I could ask maybe one of you know. With bent grass, I always thought that, I know it has the underground rhizomes, but does bent grass also have above ground stolons? I would say probably not, because they have to cut it so low. If you're cutting low, then you're going to be cutting into the stolons. So I've heard that from people. Again, I have to think critically of who I hear things from. If I'm not reading them usually from you read from a piece of literature that's been peer reviewed, you have a strong feeling that it's accurate. But sometimes I hear it from people who are quite knowledgeable, and I thought I remember hearing someone say that bent grass also has above ground stolons. Can anybody confirm that? Because I just don't think it's correct. And no one knows for sure. I would say no, but still they have the below ground rhizomes. So anyway, why am I talking about bent grass anyway? I don't know. Yeah. So thatch is good. And so all these things though can also promote excessive thatch, excessive nitrogen, irrigation, low pH. The reason of low pH is because you have maybe less in the way of decomposing microorganisms, certain types of beneficial bacteria or fungi that help to decompose the thatch. If the pH is not at a good range for them, they're not going to survive. So that would promote thatch as well. Okay. All right. So we talked about thatch enough, but it does increase insects and diseases as well. All right. I've talked about that. And there's some of you, I know commercial has definitely used soil probes. Great tool to have to get an idea of a soil profile. It's open core, usually, I don't know, maybe 5/8 of an inch, maybe some are 3/4 of an inch in diameter. And you stick it into the soil. You can go down a good foot or so, and you pull it up and you get a soil profile of not only the type of soil that's there, clay, loam, sand, what have you, moisture level, good way to determine moisture level in the soil too, but also thatch thickness as shown here, where you've got the thatch shown right there, which is about an inch or so apparently, which is already to the point where it's too much. So when you start having soil probes taking out where you have an inch of thatch, it's probably time to try to do something to reduce it, because it's going to create more problems as time goes on. And this is one of these core aeration. This is a more of a commercial operation machinery. And it has a rotary disc with multiple prongs to it. And each one of these will go into the soil, maybe at least maybe 2.5 inches or so in depth. And they'll dig down into the soil and they'll take it up as it twirls around. And then it releases it and leaves the soil core on the surface. Opens up that soil in those areas to help promote aeration and kind of open things up. And eventually those areas will close again in soil, but it'll be less dense. And so you get better root growth and penetration of those areas. But then also the soil on top that's left helps to reduce the thatch, because you're bringing up soil organisms like bacteria, fungi, or maybe some things like Orobatid mites, which is a type of mite that decomposes thatch. And you're taking it from the soil, high, lower, and putting it on top of the thatch, and then just like kind of you can break it up. If you ideally, you can break it up or just let it kind of break apart by itself. And that will help to decompose the thatch and as it kind of filters back down into the soil once again. So this is showing you here these soils. Okay. All right. And yeah, that's a golf course green. Yeah, showing you how it's been aerated. And they do this, golf courses do it at minimum twice a year. Some might even do 3 or 4 times a year. If you're a golfer and you're behind one of these core aerators, you don't like it because the roll of your ball for the next day is not going to be very good. It's going to hit these little openings in the green. And so, yeah. I'm just showing kind of a line drawing of how that works. It's just a rotating drum. That's how it works. Good way to reduce your thatch. And this increases the airspace, encourages root growth, these core openings. And then, the soil cores help provide top dressing on top of the thatch, which will then begin to help decompose that thatch. This is not a quick fix. This will take maybe a few seasons to do it. And maybe you don't need to core aerate every year, especially if the soil is relatively sandy. But if you're an athletic field or golf course, that's something you do routinely, probably multiple times per year. Whereas maybe a homeowner, depends upon your site, maybe you only need to do it once every 3 or 4 years or so. Depends upon what type of traffic it receives, what kind of compaction in place. So it's not something that's done just every year for homeowners. No way. And here's just showing you the bacterial degradation from the cores as it filters down into the thatch. All right, so what's the best time to thatch? Well, again, you can do it other times. The trouble with thatch machine, this is old, we're talking about an old machine. Wow, what was this taken, 1960? I don't know who took this photograph. I usually like to use my own photographs when I can. Sometimes I borrow some. I don't know where I got them. I can't even identify who maybe took it. But anyway, the reason why thatching machines, what they do, they have like a T-type prong that whirls around and it grabs the thatch and just simply rips it out of the ground. And it creates a lot of damage. And it's going to be taking up some good roots as well. So you want to do it in the fall, primarily. The best reason is because give that turf some time to heal. You don't want to do it right before the summer heat period. The turf's not going to look very good for quite some time then. But give it whatever's left of the fall, and then also allow the spring period. Yeah. You got ghosts in here, Mary. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that thatch is mostly, it's not going to be decomposing very rapidly. You should take it off site. Yeah. Yeah, it's not going to do the grass any good.
That's one mess right there. You got it. Never mind.
Oh, yeah.
Just do that one time. and you're ready, but-
I know. Yeah, and yeah, just be aware, when you do this, you are gonna be tearing up your turf pretty well. Yeah,
Yeah, sprinkler systems, want to make sure you can do the core, you make sure your sprinklers are.
oh, yeah. Yes,
How's that, liquid defect work?
yeah,
They have that, they also
yeah,
have
that
liquid
contains,
geovacuum.
yeah, that contains a lot of beneficial microorganisms, that's the claim. And it's just designed to be similar to what you're doing with the core aerations. You're just to accelerate the decomposition of that lignin, which is the slow decomposer part of the plant tissue. Yeah, lignin is really something that is not easy, even for microorganisms, to decompose rapidly. It just takes them time. And so that's the idea with this additional, microorganisms being put on. I'm sure it helps. But again, that's not an overnight cure. You're talking, usually with trying to reduce the thatch, especially if you're well over an inch or so, you're probably talking about a 2-year process. With not only, if you need to, go with the thatcher, which is really gonna tear the turf up, but maybe you don't have no choice if it's that much thatch. Because if you try to just do it with, these products that you purchase and put it over top, or you do the core aeration, it's going to take a while. And, it's going to take maybe a few years to really get it down to the point where it's going to be a ½ inch again. So, yeah, that's a time consumer. Yeah. So, yeah, maybe the best case when it's well over an inch is to go with the dethatch, just realizing you're going to have to recover the grass. It's going to take a season for it to recover. I think that's about it.
May I ask a question related to that, please? Hello?
Yes. Hello.
Hi. I'm sorry, I'm on Zoom. This is Lynn Bullock.
Oh, hello.
You're talking about, hi,
We were
you're
wondering
talking
who you
about
were.
thatch.
Yes, talk about thatch. Yeah.
We're
okay.
talking, okay. And then you said also to, that's the best time to seed and fertilize. So what order would you do that in?
Well, you certainly.
I mean, is it okay to do it at the same
Yeah,
time?
there is an order, obviously. You don't, you want to do the dethatching first. To get
Well,
that
that's what
out
I
of the
figured,
way.
but
Yeah, Then
is it
come in.
okay then right after that to seed or fertilize?
well, you need to clean up all the debris, all the patch that you.
Right, right.
And then, sure, you can start to overseed at that point. And you'll have to
Okay.
then also begin your irrigation practices. And when you put down new seed, you're going to have to be pretty religious with your irrigation. Probably
Okay.
on a daily basis for a few weeks.
Okay.
For your best results. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank
I
you.
was wondering who you were. So I'm glad. Have you another question, Karen? Is there any other question? Okay. All right. Yeah. Was it about that time, Mary? Yeah. Why don't we stop here? I think I had a couple minor slides, but that was it. So, all right, sure.
Steve, I have a few questions for you. Back in September 2019, I bought a 25-pound bag of brass and units on it. Make a long story short, we never used it. Now, there's a guy in my neighborhood, $18. He was telling me the large sits in that bag. Unless the chances are that all the seed will germinate. What are your thoughts on that?